So good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to a new day of this INISEG University Seminar de Vietnam War. With AUSA, we want to make this event to commemorate this important event and complement to our students who are studying a master's degree in military history and all those interested in the subject. The seminar is coordinated in conjunction with AUSA, the Association of the United States Army. It allows us to have a privilege of having international speaker of great level, of course, and which be transmitted to our students through learning and support for the area of security and defense. INISEG will continue to implement such events and enjoy all these 3 days. It is a pleasure for me to share and be part of this event together with the director of the Security and Defense area of INISEG, who has participated in different masterclass and seminar in INISEG. I give the warmest welcome to Professor David Caizal for this second day and success in all the papers that we will present today. So David, the audience is all yours.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Ante todo, dar las gracias y la bienvenida de nuevo a nuestros nuevos panelistas para este segundo día del Seminario de la Guerra de Vietnam. También dar las gracias a todos aquellos que los alumnos se están conectando para seguir estas interesantes ponencias que tendremos a lo largo de esta tarde analizando y contextualizando la Guerra de Vietnam. Quería dar las gracias también a los panelistas que vamos a tener esta tarde, al capitán Arthur Gulagsen del Royal Military College. Gracias, Arthur. Welcome, Arthur, por estar aquí con nosotros, al coronel Philip Rogers, director de operaciones de defensa en la misión de Estados Unidos en la OTAN, al doctor Brian Leslie, historiador del mando de la Academia de las Fuerzas Aéreas de Estados Unidos, al teniente coronel Don Snedeker, historiador de la 11ª División de Caballería Blindada de los veteranos de Vietnam y Camboya. Welcome, Don. Y también a Huyen Nguyen, profesora del Instituto para la Paz y los Conflictos y candidata a doctor en el Departamento de Historia de la Universidad Tecnológica de Texas. Así que a todos ellos, muchas gracias por participar en este segundo día del seminario. Y sin más preámbulos, vamos a iniciar y a empezar con la primera de las ponencias, si te parece, Laura, para presentar al capitán Arthur Gulagsen.
Of course. Thank you very much, David, for those words. And now we welcome our first speaker, Captain Arthur Galinzi, Associate Professor, Department of History, Royal Military College. And his talk will be about the B-52 strikes of the Lambert II on Hanoi in December 1972. So, Captain Arthur, welcome, and the audience is all yours.
Oh, hello. And can you hear me okay? Can you hear me all
perfect.
Right? Perfect. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen here to get going. See if I can do it.
Yeah, perfect.
Does that look okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. My just see if I can. Oh no, it should be perfect here. I'll just switch things a little bit. There we go. More centered. Okay, my presentation today is on the 11 days of Christmas. It's the 1972, December 1972 B-52 strikes of Operation Linebacker 2. And so going into a little bit of background here of why the strikes happened before centering on the actual airstrikes, we need to talk about the 1972 Paris peace talks and give some background. Now, the U.S. seeks to end its military involvement in Vietnam by 1973 at the very latest. The war is now totally politically unacceptable. The South Vietnamese do not want the U.S. to withdraw, and their resistance has stalemated peace talks with the North. U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was directed to begin secret peace talks with the North Vietnamese. President Nixon, who would be re-elected in November 1972 with a massive majority, had a clear mandate to end the war with honor and with all U.S. POWs freed. And he was very much determined to do so. Bypassing his Secretary of State, William Rogers, Nixon directs National Security Advisor, and it was very strange, a National Security Advisor doing the foreign policy or taking the lead on it, to secure a peace deal for fall 1972, concluding talks with the North Vietnamese that have gone on since 1970. Now, there was a misstep by Kissinger and Nixon. They assumed Thieu, President Thieu, Nguyen Van Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, that he would go along or could be convinced of any deal made without his participation. And a deal was secured with the North Vietnamese on the 8th of October, 1972. All POWs will be freed, U.S. POWs, for a total U.S. withdrawal, and the North would recognize the South Vietnamese government. There's total or any North Vietnamese withdrawal from the South, Laos and Cambodia was seen as largely unrealistic. President Thieu of South Vietnam's signature was needed on the documents. Thieu was determined to object to any agreement, and his exclusion from the peace talks was a misstep by Nixon. Arriving in Saigon after the deal was done, or the tentative deal, to confront Thieu with the treaty and gain his rubber stamp, Kissinger is rebuffed. Thieu puts forward 69 amendments. The U.S. knows the North Vietnamese will refuse at the peace talks. Thieu claims to be betrayed. A certain Nixon administration staff says Thieu has a point, making Nixon doubt the validity of the agreement. 20th of November, on his return to Paris, North Vietnam lead negotiator Lee Duc Tho declares the Americans are negotiating in bad faith, rejects the South Vietnamese amendments. Only the previous deal was good enough for the North Vietnamese. 13th of December, the talks break down. The North Vietnamese hint very chillingly that U.S. POWs will not be freed for any future agreement. And there's huge domestic factors impairing U.S. foreign policy at this critical time. U.S. Congress was not hostile to Nixon, but saw its role to actively end a war that should have been ended years ago. It is wary, given his previous invasions of Laos and Cambodia. Nixon had used massive air power to crush the North Vietnamese in the 1972 Easter Offensive. Come January 1973, Congress has the power to effectively stop federal Department of Defense funding for U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia, or curtail it to a large degree. And the domestic U.S. protest movement is sick of the war and is very much a political force. The U.S. Congress had witnessed the entire Vietnam debacle, and each senator and member of Congress was bound and determined to put a stop to it or use what power they could to impair it. Nixon needed to restart the talks, control Thieu, and force an agreement with the North before January 1973. Kissinger, at this point, recommends urgent, massive military operations, and Nixon executes. Nixon had earlier declared that peace was at hand. The U.S. populace expected a deal. Congress expected a deal. Congress will shut it all down. They'll shut the war down. No peace with honor, no deal on prisoners of war. The massive United States Air Force, United States Navy, United States Marine Corps aviation assets in place have been put in place to crush the Easter Offensive, Linebacker 1. They're breaking the budget. This is a huge amount of expenditure. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird points out to Nixon he needs to pass a defense appropriation bill in Congress for this Vietnam augmentation force. Nixon knows they won't do it. His back is against the wall. He orders the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of Defense to prepare massive military action and faces resistance from all sides of the Pentagon due to the reduced U.S. forces in the area. There's very few U.S. troops, if any, left in Vietnam, or a very reduced number, and the air assets have largely moved to Thailand or they're in Guam. Threatening, does not work with the North Vietnamese. On the 14th of December, Nixon threatens grave consequences for them unless they come back to the Paris negotiations. The same day, he orders the Joint Chiefs of Staff to prepare to attack North Vietnam with 3 days of air attacks using all Strategic Air Command, SAC, resources for 72 hours. Maximum effort, maximum destruction. The operation is 100% politically driven to achieve goals whose achievement had been sabotaged by U.S. missteps and South and North Vietnamese resistance. The North Vietnamese never stated they didn't want to come back to the table, but wanted to wait until Congress cuts off future funding to weaken the negotiating position of Kissinger. They know, the North Vietnamese, that they just have to wait. This operation will show the North Vietnamese the U.S. means business, but also to reassure the South Vietnamese if there is a future ceasefire violation, the U.S. was massively committed to their support to securing their signature on any sort of deal. The plan is to use the firepower of the B-52 bomber wings, a lot of them brought in from the United States onto Guam, into Thailand, to attack North Vietnam and force them to negotiate. The monsoon season is on in North Vietnam, and the use of smaller tactical fighter bombers, F-4 Phantoms, etc., the new F-111s, sometimes it's curtailed. There's 207 B-52s available. 54 at U Tapao, the Royal Thai Air Base there, 153 based on Guam at Anderson. They are $63 million each in 2021, 2020 dollars. There's no more being built. The lines of production are shut down. Strategic Air Command is very nervous about losses, seeks to impose a top-down planning structure for the upcoming missions. But this will be a dynamic change in the use of air power yet practiced in Southeast Asia. That arguably may have won the war, changed its course if used earlier on this massive scale. The B-52s have sophisticated targeting and jamming electronic warfare capabilities. There'll be a huge escort of specialist aircraft of almost any type. But the 7th Air Force in Thailand and the 8th Air Force at Guam are largely cut out of the planning. Every single lieutenant colonel, major, captain is largely chopped. The 8th Air Force only coordinates with the 7th Air Force Tactical Air Force aircraft effort from Thailand. But all the planning ability on Guam is largely misused. Everything comes from Omaha, the Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base. So the North Vietnamese Air Defense. Vietnamese People's Army, December 1972, has 36 SA-2 Guideline SAM battalions. This is a bit obsolete. This is the same missile that shot down Gary Powers. The People's Air Force has 71 operational aircraft. North Vietnam is, for all intents and purposes, a third world country, but it has enough sophisticated weaponry to make a fight of it. 47 fighters for air combat, but only a small number of the pilots are trained for night operations and have their IFR ratings. They're very young and inexperienced, so that the bulk of the air defense battle will rest on the shoulders of the SAM battalions, the surface-to-air missile battalions. So the initial strikes, nights 1 through 3, the 18th to the 20th December. The B-52s were organized in 3 bomber cells to concentrate their electronic warfare, jamming pods, and signal and jamming for their mutual defense. It's very much stronger when they're all together, close to each other. They're going to attack at night to avoid the fighters. There's a large number of support aircraft. United States Navy, large number of aircraft carriers have come onto Yankee Station. United States Marine Corps, United States Air Force, but diluted, having to service 3 B-52 waves. There's 3 different waves. So the maximum amount of support aircraft can't be all there at once. They have the F-105 Wild Weasels. These will attack the SAM sites. F-4 fighter aircraft providing fighter escort and chaff drops. They drop the tiny pieces of aluminum foil that float through the air, and it makes it look like there's a giant radar, something's there for the radar operators, and it fools them to think, the B-52s are everywhere. There's also specialist radar jamming aircraft from the United States Navy, Air Force, and the KC-135s for the B-52s that have to refuel coming in all the way from Guam. Large number of search and rescue assets are on standby, but each wave will be on the same flight path, the same altitude. 3 waves, identical, very simple. And then when they take off, you see in the photo there on the slide, there's massive numbers of B-52s. It literally takes hours for them all, taking off 1 minute at a time off Guam. It's very, very impressive. There's no time to delegate planning by Strategic Air Command. There's a tight timeline. And each B-52, after it drops its bomb load on, military and other targets in North Vietnam, it'll conduct a post-target turn, like they're dropping a nuclear weapon. And this is very much a Strategic Air Command practice. It's but when they do this, they turn the aircraft and the jamming goes sideways rather than down towards the earth, thus weakening the jamming against the SAM radars. And the B-52Gs, they're the newer models. They have weaker electronic warfare suites, some of them, and less in the way of bomb loads. They're designed for nuclear weapon attacks on the Soviet Union and the newer Soviet defenses and MiGs, not North Vietnam's. So the first night, 129 B-52s take off. There's the targets of the airfields at Kep, Phuoc Yên, Hoa Lac, andIen Bien complex. The North Vietnamese are ready. There's 68 SAMs are loosed in salvos. 2 B-52Gs and 1 B-52D are shot down. 2 B-52Ds with heavy battle damage limped to Utapao in Thailand for repairs. The Strategic Air Command tactics are based on a MiG threat, but no MiGs emerge in large numbers. One crew is rescued, the others are POWs. Attacking Radio Hanoi, a U.S. Air Force F-111 is shot down. There's no presidential address from the White House. Kissinger holds a press conference. This is very strange for example, a national security advisor today. He wouldn't give a press conference. And the B-52Gs are much more vulnerable than the older B-52Ds, who ironically have much better electronic warfare capabilities. Night 2, 93 sorties. Kin No Railroad Storage Complex, Tai Nugent Thermal Power Plant, and the Yen Bien Complex. Only 20 SAMs are launched. No B-52s are lost, but some are damaged. There's SAM depletion. The North Vietnamese army, they're running out of actual missiles. And these arrive in large cigar case boxes, or not boxes, but cases that the Vietnamese have to put them together, fuel them, and get them ready next to the battalions. But the post-target turn that the bombers do slows the B-52s. They turn back into headwinds that slow their speed by 100 kilometers an hour. It makes them more of a target for the radar and the SAMs. But no bombers are lost on this night, and the Strategic Air Command becomes confident. This is misplaced. Things look good going into what they think is the last night, and you see the short tail there of the B-52G model. That's the short tail. The B-52Ds have the huge tail. So disaster happens on the 20th of December, night 3. Targets are Yen Bien, Kin, and Amo complexes, the Tai Nugent power plant, transport hub at Bac Yang, and finally the Hanoi Petroleum Storage Complex. The North Vietnamese fire a salvo of 34 missiles into the target zone, and the SAM crews use various tactics to ensure hits and that they use the power of their radars to burn right through the jamming. The B-52 post-target turn limits the electronic warfare capability and lets the missile crews get a clear blip on their radars and slows down the bomber as it turns into the wind. 4 B-52Gs and 4 Ds and 4 Gs are lost in the first and third waves. 1 B-52G crash lands back in Thailand. Strategic Air Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha is shocked. The second wave is canceled. First cancellation in United States Air Force history since World War II due to enemy action. There's huge furor over the losses. You can see in the slide there's one Ebony 02, a B-52 hit by a SAM over Hanoi. It blows up in the air. The U.S. this shocks the United States because they have no capacity to make more in the United States Air Force. But Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force can't stop. The air power doctrine is at stake, as well as U.S. prestige and deterrence. So they stop the second wave, but the third wave goes in. There's a couple of losses during that wave. So what happened? What happened during this? The first 3 nights. The North Vietnamese has anticipated the flight patterns. The chaff effort with the little aluminum strips is weak and easily dispersed by the wind. The North Vietnamese had studied the wild weasel tactics. Those are the F-105s equipped to attack the SAM sites, and the B-52 electronic warfare jamming tactics previously near the DMZ, and had disseminated the results to the SAM battalions. There's the same simple U.S. tactics, and the waves have smaller numbers of bombers and support aircraft, rather than overwhelming the North Vietnamese all at once. Supreme Air Command General John C. Meyer, J.C. Meyer, and his staff were arguably not up to it. Strategic Air Command thinks the MiGs were the main threat, and there's no MiGs. This is not Laos, it's not Cambodia, it's not South Vietnam, where there's no air defenses. This is not an air weapons range in the U.S. It's not a peacetime exercise. North Vietnamese SAM crews exploit the bad tactics and fight the anti-aircraft SAM battle over Hanoi with determination. So nights 4 and 5, 21st and 22nd December. Nixon is furious at the turmoil and losses, and the U.S. the United States Air Force has to radically curtail its strike ability. President Nixon, though, orders the continuation of the strikes forcefully. Aghast at the losses and facing heavy pressure from the press, but he's determined to prevail. There's a massive drive within the United States Air Force and SAC to cut losses, and they are forced to examine the huge differences between the B-52D and B-52G models. The antiquated B-52Gs are actually much more effective against the guideline missiles and the Fansong radar systems. Night 4, only the Thailand U-Tapao B-52D squadrons attack. 30 B-52Ds strike the Hanoi Van Dien Storage Depot and Queen T Airfield. 2 B-52Ds are struck by SAMs and shot down. Night 5, there's no B-52 losses. An F-111 is shot down as the only strike as the B-52s go against Haiphong Harbor. And this is where the SAM sites aren't concentrated. The Bak Mei Hospital is hit during these strikes, and all medical staff are casualties. There's a heavy reaction in the US and the foreign press to this supposed atrocity. 23rd and 24th December, nights 6 and 7, there's heavy attacks by the fighter bombers and F-111s during the day to support the B-52s at night. Losses are very light for the US fighters at this time, and this helps the Air Force as the North Vietnamese are waiting for nightfall and the B-52s, they're saving their missiles for them. F-111s hit the SAM sites and airfields, and they're very effective. If the North Vietnamese know, if they shoot down a B-52, the US public and the world will take notice. The Anderson B-52s are still out of action. Night 6, there's 30 B-52s attack the Lang Drang supply depot, and the bad weather and poor planning mean no support aircraft. The B-52s are on their own. But luckily, the targets are very much away from the SAM sites, and the MiG fighters that are sent up against the B-52s are ineffective. Night 7, the Thai Nguyen Railroad hub is hit by 30 Thailand B-52s. They're very lucky. One is hit by 100 millimeter AAA fire, anti-aircraft artillery fire, but survives. You see in the slide there is a very distressing event for many of the US public. Jane Fonda, a famous movie star, she visits North Vietnam at the height of the bombing. She's visiting one of the 100 millimeter anti-aircraft gun crews right there. She's clapping her hands. She's a prominent war activist. It's a very strange event. To the Christmas break, Nixon, of course, he orders a stand down for Christmas. The North Vietnamese are assembling the missiles as fast as they can, but they're running out. The Christmas break, though, is crucial to allow them to get more missiles ready. And the B-52's decision to reduce numbers and stay away from Hanoi also helps the North Vietnamese stock up. Strategic Air Command, in a very slow manner, finally turns over tactical planning missions to 8th Air Force headquarters in Guam, which rapidly makes new effective plans for future attacks with 7th Air Force input. From the 21st of December on, U-Tapao commander, this is in Thailand, Brigadier General Glenn Sullivan, he's put incredible pressure on Strategic Air Command to argue for changes to these simple tactics that have cost lives and these hugely expensive bombers. He pays for it, arguably, with his career. Nixon is relentless. He orders massive force to be used on the 26th of December, night 8. He's determined to prevail. So this is it, night 8, the 26th of December. It's a massive attack. 8th Air Force Planning and Command staff are finally gained control of the planning procedures and command and control. The staff officers on Guam direct the operation very effectively. 120 bombers attack Thai Nguyen, Kin No, Duc Noi, Hanoi areas, Haiphong Railroad yards, and the Van Dien Storage Complex. 78 from Guam, 42 from Thailand, 113 tactical fighter bombers, Wild Weasels, the chaff bombers, the refueling and electronic warfare aircraft. North Vietnamese radar is overwhelmed by this massive electronic warfare jamming and chaff effort. There's no waves. They just come from all directions all at once at different altitudes for 15 minutes. In such a short period of time, the North Vietnamese don't know what to shoot at and can't get a proper radar picture. The Wild Weasel SAM suppression effort is very large. There's 68 missiles fired, but the North Vietnamese can't break through the chaff. Only one B-52 is shot down over Hanoi, and another is badly damaged. And you see the attack waves coming in from Thailand and coming in off the ocean in the diagram there. Nights 9 and 10, 27, 28 December, more success. Night 9, Lang Dang, Duc Noi, Truc Quang, and Van Dien are the targets. One B-52 is hit, forcing the crew to eject over Laos. Another is shot down in spectacular fashion over the Trung Quang Railroad hub. North Vietnamese are overwhelmed, though again, but fight hard, shooting down 2 United States Air Force F-4 Phantoms and a HH-53 search and rescue helicopter. Night 10, 60 B-52s from Anderson and 30 from Thailand attack. There's 6 groups simultaneously almost hit 5 target areas. 4 of these groups hit Hanoi. The North Vietnamese are now totally overwhelmed. If it hadn't been nighttime, the skies would have been black with US aircraft. They're completely overwhelming the North Vietnamese. Night 11, there's nothing left to hit largely. U Tapao, 30 B-52s take off. Guam, another 30. They attack the SAM sites at Phuc Yen and the Lang Dang transportation hubs. There's very little in the way of left of targets. The 30 B-52Gs hit South and North Vietnam away from the north of Vietnam in arc-light type missions, supporting ground forces against the NVA and VC ground forces. Strategic Air Command, under direction from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, finally ends it, finally shuts it down. So negotiations, what's going on with Nixon and Kissinger at this time? On the 22nd of December, Washington had asked Hanoi to return to Paris to discuss the terms of October that were decided upon. Vietnamese, as this bombing is raging across the capital and around North Vietnam, they're agreeable. For the North Vietnamese negotiating team, when they had returned to North Vietnam, just as they were getting off the plane, and aside here, they go into the terminal. And just as they go into the terminal, a passenger aircraft that they had flown in on is destroyed by a B-52 strike. So it's very much, it strikes home with them. Nixon dictates that he wishes technical discussions to begin 2nd January. He also stated to the North the bombing would halt if they'd agree. Decisively, he directs Kissinger to agree to the terms offered by the North Vietnamese in October. Also decisively, he chops out the 69 South Vietnamese amendments. Nixon means business and ruthlessly pursues his goal. Some US politicians, of course, nothing's ever right, are disappointed by the proceedings, and they state, this is an important quote, we had bombed the North into accepting the terms they had already agreed to. All bombing in the north of the 20th parallel in northern North Vietnam is suspended 30 December 1972. 9th of January, the talks resume fully. Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho meet back in Paris. Basically, the same deal is finalized in October before the South Vietnamese issue erupted. It's not a high point in U.S. foreign policy, and it is somewhat an ugly end to an ugly war. There's a token withdrawal of 30,000 NVA troops. North did recognize the South Vietnamese government as legitimate. DMZ is again agreed to as the boundary between the two countries. How much, of course, this limited Viet Cong activity was basically irrelevant to the U.S. at this point. Two, there's a need to placate him, but forcefully bring him to heel. And very much the Henry Kissinger realpolitik, the brutal face of politics. The South Vietnamese and the corrupt near dictatorship of Thieu was a problem in the peace talks. Nixon lies to Thieu or misleads him, stating there'll be continued massive U.S. support. This will be equipment support only. Nixon somewhat misleads him again, saying they'll respond with massive military strikes if the North violates ceasefire terms to be discussed in Paris. And there's no intention, political support, or actual funding to resume large-scale combat operations. Thieu initially still refuses to sign. 14th of January, Nixon says he will go it alone, make peace with the North unilaterally. Thieu, facing no more U.S. aid and possibly being deposed, caves in on the 22nd of January, one day before the 23rd December deadline. Matter of Laos and Cambodia, well, it's largely ignored as irrelevant. The peace accords are signed on 27th of January, 1973, ending the U.S. involvement militarily in Vietnam. The military tally sheet, 795 B-52 sorties during the 11 days. A lot of people make the play on words, the 11 days of Christmas, of course, a play on words for the 12 days of Christmas. 729 of these sorties bombed effectively, 15,000 tons of ordnance, 18 industrial and 14 military targets, wrecked large important areas of the North Vietnamese capital area. The F-111s and the F-4s contributed very heavily as well, 5,000 tons, as well as the United States Air Force, or naval aviators from the aircraft carriers. Additional 212 B-52 sorties flew in support of ground operations. 10 are shot down in combat. 5 crashed after battle damage in Laos or Thailand on the way back to U Tapao to make emergency landings or to just get over the border. 1.8% loss rate, but still brutal considering the cost of each aircraft and the elite air crew. 33 B-52 crews are KIA, MIA, 33s are POWs, prisoners of war, 26 rescued by the search and rescue helicopters. North Vietnamese efforts, this is very much a third world country doing the best it can. 180 engagements in the 11 days, 266 missiles shot off. They still, to this day, the communists see it as the Dien Bien Phu of the air. They overcame, at times, large U.S. Electronic warfare interference to force the missile engagements of the targets. The MiGs were never a factor due to the overnight bombing. They can't somewhat fly at night. Overwhelmed by the U.S. change in tactics and the sheer numbers of aircraft, the North Vietnamese, the force of the United States Air Force, just crushed them. And they're totally dependent on China and the United States, or the USSR, for advisors, the mean to fights. You see this SAM crew there in the slide. They're, of course, trained in Russia and allowed to fire off practice missiles at ranges in the USSR. Damage inflicted. 500 railroad interdictions, that's stopping a train going somewhere, 372 cars of rolling stock, 11,000 cubic meters of petroleum products destroyed, 80% of the North Vietnamese electrical power capacity disrupted, knocked down imports processed by rail through the ports to 30,000 tons per month. North Vietnamese, 1,600 dead, 306 in Haiphong in the harbor area, further 1,300 in Hanoi. You see those there in the slide. Those are the B-52Ds, the older model with the bigger tail, the shark fin. 2,000 buildings, homes destroyed or badly damaged. So Allies, world opinion, what was achieved? The Swedish Prime Minister likens the bombings to Nazi war crimes. It's very ironic, considering many Swedish volunteers volunteered in the German Waffen-SS, and there's no involvement in the Second World War by Sweden. Prime Minister of Australia, Gow Williams, severely criticized the U.S., and Australia had, ironically, urged the United States previously to widen the war in Vietnam. Newspaper headlines, of course, Stone Age barbarism, genocide, war crimes. Members of the U.S. Congress are appalled with Nixon and Kissinger. At the same time, they're shocked by his strength and determination to push through. North Vietnamese stick to the same terms as October 1972. Nixon did want to severely punish them for their resistance and making it very difficult for the U.S. to exit the war. Nixon's steadfast refusal to bend forced the effective use of massive U.S. air power to achieve his political goals. And despite his many faults and conflicting academic opinions on his presidency, Richard Milhous Nixon is and was the right man for the job at the time and one of the strongest U.S. presidents. The end state, the prisoners of war are freed. They're out of Vietnam by 1973, and Nguyen Van Thu, South Vietnamese leaders facing a war that could not be won. You see the U.S. POWs very happy they're heading home from Hanoi. Last slide, and this last slide. This is a very strange event that it can't be ignored. It says a million things about the tactics involved and the response by the air crews. The 3rd of January 1973, SAC General Myers, J.C. Myers, flies to Guam to Anderson AFB to visit the B-52 crews. Many of these crews, they're professional career officers in their 30s, 40s. He brings his family with him on a private jet. None of these crewmen had seen their families for several months. And they have a big ceremony, the Arc-Light briefing rooms, the big, briefing room at Anderson. He decorates Colonel McCarthy, the wing commander, with the Distinguished Flying Cross, who only flew on 2 missions. This does not sit well with the B-52 crews. Then he goes one step further, and he berates the crews for not following orders regarding cell integrity, electronic warfare defense, maneuvering over the target area. This threatens them with court-martial. Then something happens. The room goes silent, and fully half of the crews walk out. The segment to the rest of the 200 that are left, roughly 70 or 80, run riot. They throw their flight computers, pens, cans of Coke. A couple of them even throw chairs. Meyer is hit in the head with a can of Coke. He's driven to his knees. A phalanx of lieutenant colonels jump on the stage and grab him, and they hustle him out of the hall. The B-52 crews chase him actually out of the building. And as he's going back to his private jet, they throw rocks, bits of pavement at the staff car and Meyer. Following this, the United States Air Force conducts a massive PR campaign for Linebacker 2. And then there is an internal witch hunt in the years that follow to see who, somehow sabotaged the effort or, portrayed SAC as, somewhat incompetent. And they want to publicize their success and very much control the narrative. Brigadier General Sullivan, the Thailand commander, who forced the change of tactics and arguably saved lives and made the operation a success, is never promoted again. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. And I look forward to any questions at the end after all the other wonderful presentations. So I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Captain Arthur, thank you very much for your presentation, a really interesting and shocking topic. I am sure all the audience was enriched by the topic. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Vamos a pasar a presentar al segundo ponente de esta tarde, el coronel Philip Rogers, is Director of Defense Operations United States Mission to NATO. He holds degrees in History and French from the University of Virginia. Colonel Rogers has participated in international combat operations. Philip, thank you very much for being here and participating in the seminar. Anything, anytime you want to start. Thank you.
Okay, I think you might have me loud and clear here. Let me bring my brief up. And David, are you reading me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. And you can see the slides?
No yet.
Not yet?
No.
Share. Oh, I went to share. Okay. So let me go to Google. Yeah, let me go. Sorry about that. Let me get my I get my technician here helping me. Go to Google.
Okay.
Okay. Right there. Okay. Share. Share screen. Yeah. Hit that. Yeah, I did. And now? Well, we're waiting. So it's. Yeah. So we have share screen here. So I can fly a jet, but I can't.
Don't worry. Sometimes happen.
Yeah, we'll get it. It's not allowing us to share it. Not allowing us to share it from here that we're seeing. Laura, is there a way to pipe it from there by any chance? Yeah. Yeah, see, I mean, it's just not allowing us to. Yeah, we could be the web browser version, which we don't have the app.
Don't worry.
Okay. You don't have a way to share the slides from there, do you, Laura? I'm sorry. Yeah, Laura, do you?
Okay. Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, the latest one that I sent you. Sorry about that, because we are in a halfway classified area here in the embassy. So.
Okay. Yeah. You can don't share, yes?
Well,
you have the permission.
It's not allowing us, yeah. And then I can bring up my slides. Of course, I see them, but that's not helping anybody else here.
You can try again right now.
Yes. Okay. So share screen, and I'm trying to bring up the slides here. Yeah, you used to go select it from there. Yeah, and but if I'm seeing full screen right now, but obviously you're not, right?
No.
When you hit share screen, it should prompt you to choose it. Yeah, because when we hit share screen here, it should prompt us to bring up the slides, but I don't see that happening. So, and I don't know if it's because of our system, because we're inside the embassy here.
Okay, wait a minute.
Okay.
I tried that in our site, try to share your presentation.
Yeah, from your end, okay. And then I'll just tell you in advance if. Sorry, audience.
Don't worry, sometimes happen. Maybe you can present to the audience about your biography while I try to share your presentation.
Okay. Well, sure thing. So, listen, actually, it's very interesting times here at NATO headquarters, where I am right now in Brussels, Belgium, with, of course, the Ukraine invasion happening right now with Russia. So I wish I could have listened to some of the other presentations, although I was fascinated by the previous speaker here on the B-52s, because I am an aviator in the Marine Corps, or I was, and just recently retired. But, you know, it is talking about what's going on in Ukraine here has been nonstop for the last few weeks. This topic for the Marines, though, is, even though I'm an aviator and I was a special operator, all Marines know the Combined Action Program. It's one of the hallowed kind of well-known stories of the Marine Corps, and we've got a lot of stories. If you know the Marine Corps, of course, we're very proud of our traditions. So when I was asked, really out of the blue in Norfolk, to present here, I told David I know exactly what I wanted to talk about was the CAP program, Combined Action Program in Vietnam. I don't have too many slides because I do want to talk if we bring them up. I do want to walk you through the program because there's a lot of good things that we took out and then actually effectively used, and I'll have personal experiences I'll talk about in Afghanistan and Iraq as well, also in Kosovo, also in, to a latter extent, Bosnia and other places I've served. So, Laura, I don't know if any other luck right now, but I can.
Yeah. We shared your presentation and we start right now.
Okay, good. Okay, fantastic. So you're on the title slide right now?
Yeah, wait.
Okay. Looks like it might be coming up. Okay, fantastic. Okay, good. So I thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate that. And without further ado, I'll advance into the brief. Again, my name is Colonel Philip Rogers. I'm the Director of Defense Operations here at NATO. And I appreciate, Laura, your help here. And David, thank you for this opportunity to present this. Next slide, please. When we talk about, I kind of said a little bit about this in the, and I don't know if it'll advance from that point, Laura.
Ya, vamos a pasar al siguiente slide.
Okay, it takes a second to advance, okay, there we go. So there is a whole bunch of material here. I know we have other speakers here, Spanish and French. I do speak some Spanish, sort of in the Western Sahara, but also my mother is French, but I will try to speak slowly, but as a Marine, I will get excited. There is a lot of information available, not only in books, but this is one of the hallowed stories of the Marine Corps as far as in recent history. And again, we are very good about touting our success, but if you go, just do a quick Google search if you'd like, and you will find a lot of information on the Combined Action Platoons or program. The Combined Action Program is the name of the actual program itself, but the Combined Action Platoons was where it happened. There are so many books. The one that you see right there, the title, The Village by Bing West, kind of rings the loudest to the Marines, along with Fields of Fire by James Webb and some of the other, the Great Santini, whether it be fiction or nonfiction in the Marine Corps. This is one of the stories that almost all Marines know, and it's inculcated into us, beaten into us early on. The other title of the book, the subtitle of The Village by Bing West, who was Undersecretary of the Navy, and I'll talk about him a little bit later on. He served in one of the Combined Action Platoons, but the subtitle was 15 went in, 8 walked out. So they did, it was a very successful program, but they did take a lot of casualties. I just took a quick picture and downloaded a few shots of some of the books and some of the memoirs that are out there. And you'll see that there's if you go online, there's a lot of associations that still tie back like there are for a lot of units that have served together. There's great pride in this. At the very end, I have a YouTube link to a video that is very compelling as far as a Vietnam team that went back in the 80s and 90s, back to their old village, and were kind of hailed as heroes. So anyway, part of our lore, very, very part of our Vietnam story. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So this will be the agenda. You can read this, and if you, I'll talk about a little bit of the strategic concept. More importantly, at one particular, why the Marines? Why did this work for the Marine Corps, maybe not for some of the other services? And then for the evolution of successes, they did have shortcomings and they did have challenges. It wasn't a perfect program, but you'll see that there were some things that they really did very well. And then the CAP legacy. I've touched upon it a little bit, but how it's carried forward in the Marine Corps and even affected my career. And then CAP in the recent global war on terrorism coin campaigns, counterinsurgency, how we applied it, and then some personal experiences that maybe we'll touch a little bit upon how I saw it in play and for various measures of success or failure. Next slide, please. The strategic context. Now, this isn't the best map I could find, but it kind of gives you an idea. If you look at the, if those familiar with Vietnam and those who are studying it here, there'll be better maps, but you can see a lot of the government and communist-controlled territory. The Marines entered the war in mass in 1965. So I'm not going to give you the whole context of the war at that particular time. The Marines have been part of the advisory and assistance program from 1954 up to 1964. So it's not to say the Marines had already participated, but when the Marines came, when they augmented the forces across Vietnam, as we were tilting in a different way as far as how we were going to prosecute the war, the Marines took I Corps, which was the northernmost sector, and they occupied, 3 different enclaves. Actually, if we go back a slide, please, that'll be fine. No worries. Phu Bai, Da Nang, and Chu Lai, which might ring hollow to some of you that know these words. The Marines, of course, we did an amphibious landing first because that's what we do best, or we tout ourselves as doing. But then after that, we had the 1 Corps, the I Corps sector. Now, the Marines would fight as they always have, and this is something, obviously within our ethos, other services will make light of it sometimes, but we fought tenaciously and violently like we do everywhere. We did conventional operations, but one of our mantras, which stuck with us for a long time, and especially in the global war on terrorism, is General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, recently would always say is, a lot of this is our motto is no better friend, no worse enemy. And that was exemplified in these CAP programs, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The Marines fight tenaciously, but we are very adaptable to situations. And we're not as hidebound, we're not as set piece as some of the other services are. And we are ready and more than willing to try something new along the way. Great deal of innovation in the Marine Corps. A lot of that comes from being a smaller service, relatively speaking, in comparison to other countries, but smaller to the Army, smaller than the Air Force and Navy. But how we have to make do sometimes with hand-me-down equipment or not as much of a budget, because we are part of the Department of the Navy. Some people will say the Defense Department of the Navy. Anyway, the Department of the Navy, and so we do have a smaller budget than the other 3 services. Now, of course, we've got a Space Force as well, but we make do with what we can, and we do a lot on the innovation in the backs of the young Marines. Next slide, please. As we get to the next one, I'll talk about the Combined Action Program concept. It was essentially, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in a little bit here as you look at the Hamlet pictures you see there, because that's where it was in Marines patrolling. I guess essentially what it was. It was an operational initiative implemented during the Vietnam War. It proved to be one of the most effective counterinsurgency tools developed during the conflict. Now, not everybody would necessarily agree with this, especially when it was a search and destroy, sometimes not a pacification-friendly, although that should have probably been one of our objectives, pacification-friendly conflict. We were used and we were trained, and still to a great degree, to fight the Russian bear. Imagine that, Back to the Future, right? To fight a peer competitor. So when we were getting into what we call back in the Marine Corps, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, banana wars or other wars or war operations other than war or light intensity conflicts, it's not necessarily our bailiwick, but we can adapt. Now, the CAP program went from 1965 to 70, not exactly 5 years. It was based around a 13-man squad with a corpsman, because we don't have our own Navy, we don't have our own doctors, so we use Navy doctors and we use Navy corpsmen. And we were paired with Vietnamese militia platoons in the popular forces. And there were some other types of forces that are out there, but primarily they were local militia. And it was tied to a hamlet or village. The intention was to deny anybody sanctuary at the local village level. And this is a very localized, very personalized program. I'll kind of sum up things, but we'll get into a little bit more detail here. In 5 years of operations, the Combined Action Platoon has operated more than 800 hamlets, comprising an area of over, essentially 10,000 square miles, 500,000 Vietnamese plus or minus civilians in the I-Corps area of operations. And at one time, over 20% of the villages in the I-Corps area had some kind of CAP, whether it was the roving program, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or the static program tied to them. Essentially, it was a way to kind of an economy of force, if you want to use that term. You can stay on this slide. Economy of force, but also a way to maximize what we could do. And you'll see hints of that later on when I talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. Why the Marines? Why did this work here? You can see the picture down on the bottom, and that's okay, Lord, you can go to the orange slide. The Banana Wars are what the Marines were famous for, and what we call the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Essentially 1915 to 1934. And household names of the Marine Corps like Chesty Puller, Brute Krulak, and Mike Edson, and some of the Pete Ellis, all these other kind of innovative Marines in between the wars. So we were a very, very small force. We usually get increased during times of major war and then decreased afterwards. And the Marine Corps has faced extinction a few times in the interwar periods because, unless we find our own special niche, we've got other forces that can do that in the States. Now, the history was forged in counterinsurgency and so-called Banana Wars, like I talked about. A lot of us were raised through that mindset. We do understand, when I say Banana Wars, maybe a little bit pejorative nowadays, but it was places around the world that were islands, nascent democracies, or perhaps not. But one of the things that we specialize in the Marine Corps as well throughout and to this day is decentralized operations and command and control. It's kind of a Marine taught trait. Small unit tactics and operations are our specialty. We very much count on that. And the strength of the NCO Corps. And when we say non-commissioned officers in the Marine Corps, we mean sergeants and below, because almost 60 to 70% of our force is sergeants and below. We're a very young force. Our average age averages to this day around 20, 21, 22-year-old, and usually they do short tours, so we turn over very quickly. Very small officer to Marine ratio, purposely built that way. But innovation, leadership, can-do, imagination, and a strong esprit de corps, the Simpus Fidelis mindset, which drives some other services crazy, but frankly, it means the world to us, is essential to what we do. We're not afraid of going against the grain and trying new and different tactics. We've shown that sometimes to our own fault, where it doesn't work necessarily. And that's why I say we're rewarded for such, but sometimes to a degree. We don't have, not everybody's an innovator, not everybody's out there on the leading edge. We do have Marines that think, the same way as some of the other services go. But I think this is what set the environment for this CAP program to work, because there are other examples that were adopted by the Army and other services that did not work quite well. It might sound a little bit like special forces teams today that are small teams, A teams that go out and work with the local populace. Essentially, that's what it was. But really, before that really became across, as large as the special forces groups are today. Next slide, please. Okay, the next I'll talk about the CAP evolution. For a program, essentially, and I'll get to that at the end. In 1965, and some of this is a little bit lore, maybe apocryphal. Some people don't know this is this, but it's penned back to the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel William Taylor in the Fubai area, where a typical Marine leader said, "Okay, I've got 20 square miles, I believe, 10 square miles, an airfield, 6 villages got out of control. I've got 3 companies, a 4th company if you count the headquarters company. How do I manage this? And I'll tell you, this is the same problems that I saw in Iraq later on in Anbar province or in Afghanistan when we were in down in Helmand. It's amazing how some things never changed. But one of the key things is they drew up the plan to say, okay, maybe we can embed and incorporate the local militia units to augment us. The request went all the way up to the chain of command, a bunch of people, but imagine this, Lieutenant General Victor Brukulak, his son ended up being commandant on the Marine Corps, happened to be the Fleet Marine Forces Pacific commander, who willingly and immediately recognized it for what it was. He was one of those Banana War Marines way back in the day. He understood the concept and immediately it was bought into. And not only that, it was looked at as, hey, this could be a game changer. Not on a big scale yet. Of course, they needed to try it. The initial Marine unit leaders who were drawing this up were carefully screened. They were paired with the popular forces, and not to denigrate them, but they were kind of a weak, poorly trained guard, usually outfitted by, and I asked the stats here later on, but by the younger, not able to join the Vietnamese forces or the older ones, and only making $19 a month, which was about half the pay of the South Vietnamese regular. But what they lacked in the tactical prowess, they made up for it in their knowledge of the human terrain, which is key in a coin operation, key to any kind of hearts and minds program. Now, this was not necessarily looked at favorably across the enterprise, across South Vietnam. It was unorthodox, a little bit risky. It was not in its approach for coin, but in the light of the war at that point where, I say the naysayers and no-nicks were like, yeah, hey, whatever, it's search and destroy, it's seizing terrain, it's set-piece battles, et cetera, et cetera. So they were going out on a limb to do this. Next slide, please. So the CAP evolution, I'll talk about this early patch a little bit later on. After initial successes, the program was formalized in '67. 10-day to 2-week school, graduation certificate, you got some cool patch, and later on it was some kind of pen, but not a huge investment up front, and they were volunteers as well. And I'll get to that in a second. You have to remember that most combat tours at this particular point, it was a volunteer force to a certain extent, which was then augmented by the draft. So it was usually 1-year tours, very quick, train, get in there, get out, and then you're done. Marines do short tours, and they were sometimes shorter than 3 or 4 years. So the turnover and the curve was quick in the Marine Corps. You had to get the forces out to the field. So combat replacements show up, and at that point, it wasn't whole unit for unit replacing. In some instances, it was you got combat replacements, and they filled in. And then, of course, it was one of the stipulations was you had to have been 2 months in country already. So you had a little bit of experience, but you had to have 6 months left on your tour so you could be effective. So very popular program, but at the end of the day, only a certain small percentage actually started doing this because the Marines still had regiments and they still had a division. They were still fighting static battles. And you've heard of, Hue City and Khe Sanh and some of the incredible actions that the Marines took. But this was a program that was actually throughout all 4 of those enclaves that I talked about. Now, the CAP was initially tied to the Hamas and the force, and it was very, very popular. And they were infantry at first, so they had the small unit leader tactics down, so they could work with the militia, and they became very, very popular. Now, one thing that was very key to this too is you had you had the General Thuyn, I think his name was, if I recall correctly, not Thuyn, Chuang, who was very supportive of this and told the militias, yes, they could do this. So separate chains of command, but tactically underneath the Combined Action Platoon Marines and the corpsmen. So it really worked well as far as understanding the human terrain. But for the longest time, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here, they were static in their in the hamlets they were at. So they would sleep, they would eat, they would learn, they would learn the languages, they would essentially become villagers. But also the enemy understood that, and the enemy has a boat, so they started attacking them. So the roving CAP was started in 1968, where we had CAP platoons that were, stretched out over the 3 or 4 villages, and they did more patrolling with the militias in between towns, sleep in the field, do small unit leader tactics there. There was another thing that kind of shaped it later on here, but I'll talk about that in a second. The roving cap was also successful too. So in a sense, it broadened their aperture as far as seeing more of the villages, bringing more into the fold, if you will. Also, being able to rove allowed the Marines better freedom of action, to reduce the casualties, so that they weren't ambushed in known villages, whatever the case may be, while also allowing them to exercise another Marine forte, which is combined arms implementation. Every Marine is a rifleman first, but every Marine also knows how to employ, whether you're a cook, a candlestick maker, a baker, or a machine gunner, you know how to bring in fires from artillery, from ships, from air, and whatever else that you may need. And we know how to effectively employ it. So that was very lethal. Now, one of the challenges, though, was, at first it was infantry Marines. Then after a while, towards the end of the program, it was any Marines. So you had a lot of more rear echelon Marines. Even though every Marine is a rifleman, you had a cast of characters from different specialties, logistics, whatever the case may be, who could fight, but they weren't as savvy or they weren't as well versed in small arm tactics, which cost them a little bit. They also were, one of the things that the Marines were very good about, and I think in most successful programs, is they invested in their leadership to make sure that they had the right chain of command and the right coverage to make sure that these CAP programs just didn't die on the vine, or, hey, let's just do it because we're supposed to. They actually put some of their best leaders in there. The General Walt had signed a Lieutenant Colonel William Corson to kind of oversee this CAG program while I was in country. He spoke 4 different dialects of Chinese. He had a PhD. He was also known for being very savvy in the Vietnamese population. So you had instructors who believed in the program and also infused it with what they were supposed to do. They drafted up 6 specific missions that they were supposed to execute. Next slide, please. Okay, CAP successes. So by 1970, this program had reached its peak, and at its top or its peak, right before it dissembled, 42 Marine officers, which is a big ratio of officers to 20 that was actually in Vietnam at the time, with 20, essentially 2,000 enlisted men. And then we have naval officers and corpsmen, because again, we don't have our own docks, or sometimes we have we have sailors, or we should have officers who are gunfire support specialists. Organized into 114 CAPs, combined action platoons, and they partnered with over 3,000 RF and PF soldiers. The largest CAG of the 4 was in the Quang Nam province, consisted of 36 CAPs and 700 officers and men, while the smallest in Quang Tri had 18 CAPs. So on September 21st, 1970, the Marines officially deactivated the program, not because it was not going gangbusters, and not because it wasn't doing well. It was just commensurate with the drawdown of American forces in Vietnam. But as I hearkened to earlier, I mean, it was very, and you can leave it on this slide, it was very successful in the sense that over 800 hamlets, 20% of the villages in that particular area. I mean, I can't even imagine that scale when we had forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. I wish we had that scale and size when we were trying to win hearts and minds. I mean, this is a huge effort. And again, it's small, but it's only 2.8% of the 79,000 Marines that were there at any one time, going in and out. The shortcomings: magnificent imaginative approach, but not tied to a larger strategic approach. So unfortunately, if you, it's great that you're doing hearts and minds in one particular province, but if you're not doing it, wholesale or throughout the AOR, it was too little, too late, a drop in the bucket compared to assets dedicated elsewhere. And it doesn't take, you can pacify a certain area and win all the hearts and minds you want, but if a province south of you or very far south of you or around you is actually in the hearts of a guerrilla insurrection, you're not going to overall win the fight. In this particular case, I say the tyranny of war gets in the way of success. People were minorly interested in this from outside the Marine Corps, although the Marine Corps thought it was a gangbuster program. There are some, to include General Westmoreland, who was like, yeah, I don't really believe in the pacification. What I need to do is make sure that I win the set piece battles, fight a larger war, take it to the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. His concern was, although he reverses his opinion later in his memoirs, his concern was, if I spread all my forces through all these little villages, they'll just get picked off. Well, sir, that's one way to look at it. But we also know that's not a way to win your war. And I'll say this later on. You cannot kill your way out of an insurgency. You cannot kill your way, and we found that out the hard way, even though we knew that going into global war on terrorism. You've got to win the hearts and minds. Okay. So when kill counts and terrain, seas, and hell, set-piece battle considered the determinants of success. That's what the measure was at that particular time. If you go back to the Whiz Kids and all the folks that were thinking like, hey, we should be winning this war if we just put more assets into it. It's the winning of hearts and minds that goes unheralded. Short tours of duty obviously did not foment continuity either. 6 month, 7 month tours when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan from American model, that didn't provide the continuity either, but you had same units taking a break, coming back, and then rotating through. So there was some familiarity with terrain. But you probably know some of these sayings. The American says we never lost a battle, and true. It is the rejoinder from the Japanese, but at the end it did not matter. Or, we've heard this with the Taliban, you have the watches, but we have the time. One of the challenges, though, they were paired, I touched upon this briefly, they were paired with forces that were often weak. As the young and the elderly were the meat bones of these popular forces. And force multiplication or force multiplier can only go so far. Also, like a lot of times here, there are, when we see these kinds of things, there, $19 a month, is that what the young man or older man is going to risk his life for? Also, corruption and graft, just like we saw in Afghanistan, is ghost soldiers. We're paying for 1,000, but really there's only 600 on the rolls because somebody's skimming off the top. And this is, this is not just a Vietnamese problem or Afghani or Iraqi problem. This is a worldwide problem that exists. Very, very hard to break that paradigm sometimes, especially when we're just told, hey, shut up and just do your mission. Or they just outweight you and outlast. Okay. Next slide, please. So the CAP legacy continues on to this day in the Marine Corps. Just a few of the many, many things I could have pulled out from the information that I saw in my research. The 209 villages protected by CAP units in one sector, not one ever reverted to VC control. There is no more, I will tell you, telling statistic than that. Obviously, when the American forces left and the Allied forces left Vietnam, those things were reverted. But the VC propaganda, I love this one, could not explain this fact away, no matter how, and they're great at disinformation, what have you. In fact, they just gave up trying with the CAP program and focused themselves in other areas. General Westmoreland, who led us in the war for the majority of it, well known for it, a big proponent of set-piece battles, massive forces, in his memoir said the CAP program was one of the most ingenious innovations developed in Vietnam. And I can't tell you how many more other coin specialists from other countries said best in breed, best model that they've seen, very successful for what little was put in, how much they gained from it, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't like to go into kill ratios, but I thought this was an interesting statistic I saw someplace. You don't want to get into counting kills, which is something we digressed into in Vietnam, that led to My Lai and a bunch of other things. An arbitrary debunked concept, like I said, you can't kill your way out of insurgency. But the CAPs, by using the combined arms firepower and by knowing the human terrain better than others, killed more ratio-wise for the size of the unit than whole divisions were at the time, like the 101st Airborne Division and others. Again, not to belittle their progress, but when you look at what they were bringing to the fight, not only winning hearts and minds, but then also killing the right bad guys, if that's the case, that's a huge legacy. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Captain Coin. I'll tell you what, this it reverberated so powerfully through the Marine Corps. The Combined Action Program was immediately seized upon when we were going back. Well, I say going to war, the global war on terror. The village, which I mentioned earlier by Bing West, was closely perused, for its secrets to success. And it's no surprise that Bing West, not only being a former Marine and Undersecretary of Navy and a kind of a outspoken person, was a very popular figure for the Marines during the war. And he wrote books like The Strongest Tribe, The March Up, the wrong war, 1 million steps. I mean, he really knows from his days there how powerful it was, an image for him, what he accomplished then, how he's kind of propagated that forward and taught us along the way. Similar programs on a smaller scale were used in Iraq and Afghanistan with varying degrees of success. So why do I say that? You know, we tried. You know the history recently as much as I do. You know, and a couple of telltale pictures of Marines doing what they do. But you know, in this particular instance, we weren't there for the long haul. We didn't know how long we were going to be, although Afghanistan turned into a 20-year war. Iraq longer than we anticipated. But where it was implemented, and I was out in the Anbar province when the revolt of the Sheiks happened, I will tell you, and I'll talk about some very personal stories afterwards, I will tell you that where we were embedded and where we were living was very powerful and did make a difference. In some cases, you just had to just give it to these young Marines and soldiers, and sometimes mixed platoons and guard guys, gals. I mean, living in a hole with a bunch of Iraqis in a police station, not knowing if they're going to get shot the next day or not, but really sometimes changing the whole tipping point of a village. But you know, when we get back to it, I talked about briefly 1 year tours in Vietnam, punching your ticket, getting out there. Essentially, we had shorter unit tours, quick turnovers, not the continuity and handover. Battalion commanders and area commanders came in and did different things different times. Sometimes it just confused the local populace, and sometimes more bullets and ballots and ballots and bullets, if you want to look at it that way. It made it more difficult to implement. Next slide, please. So I'll just end up with a few personal stories here. You know, again, an aviator. I was flying F-18s and A-6s back in the day, but I was also always involved with special operations. So I kind of do one tour and another here and there. So I would go out with the grunts often. Now in Fallujah, Ramadi accompanied a couple of regimental commanders out to Fallujah, where again, if I could just give you this eye-watering scene of just, and this is after the big Fallujah fight. I'm talking about afterwards when we had forces in platoons and sometimes just teams. And when we say a Marine Corps team, that's essentially a 4-person team with maybe a corporal in charge, living with the locals. You know, I mean, in their houses, we would rent their houses out. I remember going by to see some of these, and you were just like, my gosh, how are you doing this? Not only hour after hour, but day after week, after a month for a whole tour. And really recognizing when you saw something, just like any commander, when you walk up to a site or a base or to a barracks, you can say, these guys have their stuff squared away. Okay, maybe not so much here, but at some of these places, you just knew, they knew the pulse and the feel of the village they were in. And this harkens, you know, this is right to the heart. This harkens back to what we do best as Marines and small unit leaders. And Ramadi as well. Having gone down there to see some of my airborne controllers who are out there living with not only Anglo teams, if you know what that is, but just fire support teams, and living, with the locals, and in some cases being killed by the locals, or traitorred by the locals, or if you look at it that way, they have a right to defend themselves, but in some cases changing the dynamics of the whole battle. When I say what happened in Dulab, that is a picture, not of my Humvee, but the Humvee that was behind me in a patrol. We had just established, Dulab was outside of the base called Al-Sad. Big, huge base, still exists to this day. Maybe some of you have served there. I went with 7th Marine Regiment to the commander and just a recon out to Dulab to visit the local set piece coin, cap program, if you will, that they had just established in Dulab. We were with the 7th 7th Iraqi Infantry Regiment. They were paired, and we had a colonel there. And I remember just meeting him, and we're going through the town, and the Marines had set up individual places where they were living in houses, sometimes alongside other families, sometimes we were renting, but they had just started the program. So we're giving out water, we're doing, it's hot, we're giving out water, we're giving out, candy, MREs in some cases, whatever, doing the local chat up, having tea in a particular case. But as we left this particular building, I remember thinking like, wow, this is I'm used to flying over this at 15,000 feet. This is pretty impressive. The Marines had only been there 3 or 4 weeks, but they already knew a lot of the villagers. Although And this is within sight almost of Al-Assad base, where we considered it friendly territory. This is right before the rise of the Sheiks. Well, as we get out and we mount up into our 7 Humvees, now this is with the regimental colonel. We ended up being a 1-star, and then the 7th Infantry Regiment Iraqi. As we're patrolling out, we see mopeds, young men on mopeds start to fan out through all the vehicles leading us south. And now, of course, the hair on the back of your neck starts to stand up. We drove over a hump, the first vehicle, second, third, fourth. I was in the 6th, and then after that, the 7th, boom. And it's essentially, that's the Humvee that was left over. At first, we couldn't find the colonel. Everybody had been ejected from the vehicle, but the colonel was in the back seat, and he was charred and unrecognizable. I just shook his hand. And I remember just thinking, like, okay, this is their village. The intent, we just given out water. Okay, we haven't won the hearts and minds here yet, but gosh darn it, they're not going to get to us this day. This was a traumatic event. I mean, we still talk about it to this day, how powerful this moment was. And at first we thought we were in a firefight because all the rounds were cooking off from the vehicle, and there was a lot of rounds inside of it. So we were ducking and we were looking up in the hills. And I just remember it eerily quiet. It's not like a movie where all of a sudden the crescendo of music goes up. And I remember one of the Marines leaning over to me going, "Hey, sir, you know what's really messed up?" And he used that word. He goes, "They're probably filming us right now." That gives you the heebie-jeebies. But why I tell you this poignant story, how it dealt, how powerful it was, we stayed in that village. We made sure that we weren't going to lose in that particular instance. And I will tell you, about 2 months from there, that would have never happened again. Matter of fact, it didn't happen again in the tour, as far as I know, because I left a little bit early from that tour. For another year, the 7th Marines were there, and it never happened again. And they think that they got all the moped guys who were not necessarily from that town out of there, and we did a few operations to make sure we cleaned it up. But just a night and day difference on how just knowing that human terrain can be very, very personal, and how it can mean a lot to you. Afghanistan, not as much on the ground. I was with the SF at the time, and so it was more raids and training and working with their version of Green Berets, what have you. But the omelet teams that we had, and in Helmand Province, the embeddeds that we did were, again, just essentially key to any success we had. Now, I can tell you from personal experience and from any lore and anything that you read that it takes time. We're in Kosovo, and I bombed that place in 1999. We're in Kosovo 23 years later. We are in, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. We're still in Iraq in some way, shape, or form. It takes time. And one of the ways, and you can't kill your way out of a thing. You need to have a hearts and minds program that actually not just speaks to that, but that works. So I will get off a little bit of my soapbox here, but I really, not only did I want to share with you an important part of Marine Corps history, but then also tell you how it has affected us and how it, in the Marine Corps, how we carry it with us every day. I hope I can stick around for questions, although I do need to get back to my Ukraine work. But this has been a pleasant oasis of being able to take a break before I go back into the maelstrom. I left this link to a YouTube. It's not super exciting. It's about 50 minutes long, but it is super powerful watching these men go back to their villages and that they worked in. This is one of these programs where you bring back the old vets and you go back and they are hailed as heroes. And at one particular point, one deputy said, "We wish we had lost the war," we wish we would go to war with you again and lose so that you could come back and live with us. And I mean, there's just poignant moments like that. And you can tell and these are young volunteers, not lifers, who really, really made an impact, and it also impacted them. So, Laura, I want to say thank you for being my slide projector changer. I also want to, David, thank you for allowing me to participate, for General Swan for hosting this, and for all the briefings before and afterwards. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't look back to the Vietnams and other places to make sure that we don't forget the hard lessons learned. Okay, I thank you.
Colonel Rogers, thank you very much for your presentation. A really interesting paper looking at the combined action program in the maritime sector in Vietnam during the war. Thank you very much, Philip.
So now we talk with our next speaker, Dr. Brian Leslie. He's a humanities historian at the United States Air Force Academy, and his talk will be about the American Air Wars of Vietnam. So, Dr. Brian, welcome, and the audience is all yours.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And first and foremost, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Wonderful. Then the next step here would be the share the screen option. And as long as that works, I think we'll be good to go. So as long as you can see that.
Yeah, we can see.
All right. Well, then I will jump right into it here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I apologize. I'm joining kind of late. I only jumped on about 10 minutes ago. Unfortunately, I lost my military ID card yesterday. So I have been running around trying to get a new card. And even once I had the new card, that didn't necessarily mean that I could log into my computer. So I only got things fixed and figured out here about 15 minutes ago. So I'm excited to be here, but I'm also excited that everything seems to be working. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a book I just finished last year, and it's called Air Power's Lost Cause, The American Air Wars of Vietnam. And the reason I wrote this book is I wanted to make sense of something that I had studied extensively, but I really did not have the sense that I understood it in its entirety. So what I wanted to do is I wanted a book that anyone could pick up, and it would be a one-stop shop, if you will, for everything that went on in the air during the American involvement in the Vietnam conflict. Now, the second reason I wrote this book is basically someone asked me to. I had finished up a previous work. A press came to me and said, hey, we're interested in having you go back and revisiting the air wars in Vietnam. I said, that's a great idea. And no sooner had I decided to do that than a second press came to me and said, hey, we'd like you to go back and write a book about the history of the U.S. Air Force. And I said, yeah, great, I can do that. And I realized that I had basically committed to writing 2 books at the exact same time. Do not do this. This was a mistake. It is partially worked out for me. And I'm happy to say I've got one of these done. The only benefit to it is that I wrote the bulk of Air Power's Lost Cause, or let's say I wrote the bulk of a book about air power in Vietnam. And then I stepped away from it for several months. And in those several months, a couple of things happened. The most important of which was that my actual thesis kind of began to develop and coalesce. I kind of took a break from reading about airplanes, and I went back to reading about the American Civil War just as a break from everything with wings or rotors. And it kind of came to me in this moment that there was something that we in the United States here call the lost cause ideology. And that harkens back to our American Civil War. And what lost cause is so in the American Civil War, if you're not familiar, you had the Union and you had the Confederates or the rebels. And at the end of the day, at the end of the war, obviously the Confederates lose the war. But in that loss, those who lost the war began to develop ideas and motives, and they sought to justify their own actions. And they sought to find something positive in their failure, in their loss. And so they also wanted to provide their children and future generation of Southerners with their own narrative of the war. And we here in the United States call that lost cause ideology. And what I found was that there was some lost cause ideology in the American involvement in Vietnam. There were certain quote unquote truths that American airmen came out of the war with that I wanted to attack. I wanted to find out if these so-called truths were true, were they relevant, and did they still have a place in our study of American air power? And so the biggest lost cause facets that came out of the American air war was that, one, more bombing earlier would have changed the outcome. If we had just attacked North Vietnam in 1965 or 1966, the way that we did in 1972, the war would have ended earlier, right? So that's one tenet. The other tenet is that much heavier bombing later in the war, the bombing that we did conduct in 1972, particularly in December of 1972, won the war for us, or at least allowed us to end the war with honor, to get out with honor. I find both of those really complicated statements, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about them in turn as we go forward. So really, what you see here is that there are more than one air war going on at any time in the American involvement in Vietnam. And depending on how you want to look at it, there could be 4, 5, or even 6 kind of separate air campaigns going on at any given moment. And I'll cover each of those in turn. First, I'll discuss the war in the South, and there's 2 aspects to that war. There's the close air support war to troops in contact on the ground, and there is the Army's air mobile war. Kind of following that into the mid-60s, the war expands, and we get into the second war, the war in the North. Now, we call the war in the South the in-country war, the war in the North the out-country war, and I'll discuss how the war in the North is actually 2 or even 3 separate air campaigns, depending on how you want to look at it. Then we have kind of the shadow wars, the phantom wars that go on in Laos and Cambodia. And I'll kind of end up talking about the strategic air war, because again, that is separate from a lot of separate from a lot of what else is going on. So to set the stage, and again, I don't know if you've seen numerous maps in your presentations here, but this is kind of an overview of what the war looks like from the air. So you can see where Americans are based in South Vietnam. You can see the red line there that represents the what we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, what the North Vietnamese basically called their strategic supply route. You can see the entrances to it. You can see the exits to it in South Vietnam. You can see that it basically runs through Laos and Cambodia. So if you are going to stop the flow of supplies going from the north to the south, you're going to have to do something with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I would also draw your attention to the numerous American bases. Well, really, they are Royal Thai air bases, but bases where the Americans are stationed in Thailand. And so you can see that North Vietnam is kind of bracketed by bases to its southwest, its southeast, and then, of course, Yankee and Dixie Station, where the Navy flew out of in the South China Sea off to your right-hand side there. This is, typical organizational chart, but I think the important thing to note here is that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 different air components to what is going on in Vietnam. To your left, you have Task Force 77, which is the United States Navy. They will sometimes come together with the Air Force and an Air Coordinating Committee. And so that is an attempt to get the Navy and the Air Force on the same page. You have the 7th Air Force, which is the United States Air Force's leading warfighting echelon in the South. You have the 13th Air Force. I'm not going to cover them a lot, but then you have the 8th Air Force. And you'll notice that the 8th Air Force is stationed at Guam. And that is your strategic bombers. Those are your B-52s, or at least that's where they are headquartered. So you see that there are 3, if not 4, kind of separate Air Force air organizations. All right, Navy, Air Force, and then Strategic Air Force, because at no time does the military advisor for air in Vietnam, at no time does he control all of the air assets. And this chart actually comes from General William Momeyer, who was one of the 7th Air Force commanders. He was one of the leading airmen in Vietnam. And he says in his book, Air Power in Three Wars, that this was just disjointed. From the very beginning, he worked at trying to bring all of the disparate air commands under one organization, and he was never really successful in doing that. This chart just kind of gives you an idea of what air power for the U.S. Air Force looked like in Vietnam. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this here, other than to say that you can see that we had everything from tactical fighter wings, strategic air wings, special operation wings, reconnaissance wings, active in Vietnam and based in South Vietnam and Thailand. Just to kind of give you an idea of how large an operation this was. So let's break it down. Let's look at the disparate air wars as they occurred. So the first is the war in the South, what we commonly call the in-country war. And this is really made up of two pieces. It is primarily a close air support war. That is to say that it is Army, Navy, and Marine units providing support to the troops on the ground throughout their various operations. So this is everything from the Battle of Ai Drang to Silver Bayonet to defense of Marines at Khe Sanh. And I think, at least here in the United States, that this is the war that most Americans are familiar with. If there is going to be a film made about the American experience in Vietnam, it is primarily going to focus on the war in the South, because, of course, this is where the troops, the Army and the Marines, are fighting the Viet Cong and later the regular North Vietnamese Army. So popular films, Hamburger Hill, Platoon, We Were Soldiers, Full Metal Jacket, all of these are operations that take place in the South. And air power plays a particular role, not only in these movies, but obviously in all of these operations. And so this is the war that most Americans are familiar with. So when they think about soldiers in trenches or soldiers in Saigon or the ubiquitous Huey helicopter, this is the war in the South. Now, I don't know how many of the other presenters would agree with me or disagree with me here. Most air power scholars tend to kind of separate out the U.S. Army's air mobile war because it is essentially moving troops, from one point on the ground to another point on the ground. But it is my opinion, and I have written that the Army's rotary wing helicopter air war is air power, right? As far as I'm concerned, it's a helicopter. It lifts off the ground. It flies. It is air power. But what we see here is the Army during Vietnam develops and uses its own kind of specific concepts of air power. And so that's the war in the South. And so as we know, the war in the South, we can choose a bunch of dates here. But for sake of argument, let's say that this goes from 1961 until about 1971, when we began to withdraw the majority of our troops there. Obviously, once we have the Gulf of Tonkin, we have the introduction of jets. The air war ratchets up to a higher level. Of course, previous accords actually prevented us from having jets in theater, in country. But that all changes after the Gulf of Tonkin. And so I would also note that in the South, there's also the training component where we are attempting to train South Vietnamese aviators to fly and provide close air support to their troops on the ground. But no less a persona than General Curtis LeMay noted that at any given time, you may have a South Vietnamese marked aircraft with South Vietnamese aircrew, a South Vietnamese marked aircraft with American and South Vietnamese aircrew, an American marked aircraft with South Vietnamese aircrew, an American marked aircraft with South Vietnamese and American aircrew. It was a completely confusing situation in that training environment. Most of the time, the American pilot was supposed to sit in the back. But again, Curtis LeMay noted that what American pilot wants to sit in the back when he can take control of the mission. So even the training of the South Vietnamese Air Force caused a lot of consternation and confusion. So in the mid-60s, we introduced jets. And just a few photos here to kind of show you all of the different type of aircraft that the Americans utilized during the war in Vietnam. Everything from the F-4, the F-105, the F-100 on the left side, rotary wing aircraft, medium bombers, strategic heavy bombers, World War II era propeller-driven aircraft. I mean, really, the bulk of these forces is brought to bear in South and North Vietnam. Now, again, one thing I know is that this is a force that is essentially trained and equipped to fight a war in Western Europe. This is the force that's going to go to war against the Soviet Union when they come through the Fulda Gap. So there were a lot of changes, a lot of doctrine that was created on the fly. In particular, if you think of the F-105 on the left-hand side of your screen there, in the middle, here is an aircraft that is principally designed to deliver tactical nuclear weapons that is kind of forced into service as a conventional attack aircraft. The same is true with the F-4 Phantom, an aircraft that's principally designed for U.S. Navy carrier defense, that the Air Force has kind of forced upon them by McNamara. And so we have an air superiority fighter that is a very capable air-to-ground attack aircraft as well. All right, so let's move towards, once we introduce jets in the mid-1960s, we move into the war in the North, or the Out-Country War. And again, it seems that what is going on in the North is completely divorced and separate from what is going on in the South. And I'll talk a little bit about the strategic bombing campaigns here in a little bit, Rolling Thunder and then the linebackers. But even the way that we, the Americans, set up the war in the North is a complete mess. The first thing we do is we divide the country into 7 separate route packages, starting in the South and moving north 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6A and 6B. And so the Air Force will fly in 5 and 6A. The Navy will fly in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6B. And never the two shall meet. And a lot of times in the research that I did for this work, I would find messages between, 7th Air Force or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or the Chief of Naval Operations, and they would be talking about what the other service was doing in their route packages. So it seemed that even in the midst of this conflict in Vietnam, that the United States Air Force and the United States Navy were at war with each other as much as they were at war with the North Vietnamese. And so there would be cause for concern, say, if the Navy suddenly began to achieve a higher air-to-air kill ratio. Well, now the Air Force is worried about falling behind. And that goes on, from the time that we introduced jets until we pull forces out in 1972. I would also point out, I think I've made the point that the Air Force and Navy war were very different. I mentioned that the Air Force is using primarily, but not exclusively, F-4s and F-105s for their bombing missions. The Navy actually has dedicated attack aircraft in the form of the A-6 Intruder and later the A-7 Corsair. And in the course of researching this book, I interviewed numerous attack pilots who flew in these missions. And it was always the Navy attack pilots who pointed out to me on more than one occasion that, let there be no doubt, the war in North Vietnam was a Navy attack pilots war. That's how they perceived it, and that was the lens through which they viewed the war. So we divide the country up, and you'll note that you can see Hanoi and Haiphong circled in red there, and then you can see a 10 to 20 mile barrier up against the border with China. These were no-go areas. You could not attack these areas, especially in the period 1964 to 1968 during Operation Rolling Thunder, for a number of reasons. One, the United States was very concerned, and they had very good reason to believe that we could inadvertently kill a Soviet or Chinese member who was aiding the North, and we could inadvertently pull China or the Soviet Union into the conflict. Obviously, North Vietnam knows that we are not attacking these areas, so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where they keep a number of their supplies. In fact, American pilots flying in route packages 5 and 6 could often look down and see numerous supplies on railroads right up against the border with China and in Hanoi and Haiphong that they simply were prohibited from going after. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the strategic air war and Operation Rolling Thunder. Again, it seems to be almost divorced from what's going on in the South, other than what the Americans are trying to do in North Vietnam from 64 to 68 with Rolling Thunder, is send these complicated messages to the North Vietnamese that, if you do not pull your forces out of South Vietnam, if you do not stop, fomenting insurrection against the South, we will make it hard on you. The problem here is that the American Air Force in particular wants to execute a strategic bombing campaign. The same thing, the same type of doctrine we used in World War II, the same type of doctrine we used in Korea, we want to use here. We want to attack strategic and operational level targets that will make it hard for the North Vietnamese to continue to provide war-making weapons to their forces. Obviously, the problem with this is that most of the weapons that the North Vietnamese are using do not come from North Vietnam. They're not made in their industrialized targets. Most of them are coming from China and the Soviet Union. So we are at the same time attempting a strategic air campaign against a country that it's not going to have much of an effect against, and we are not able to go after what we might consider prime strategic or operational level targets because they're off limits. So I don't really want to say, I kind of do, that Rolling Thunder was doomed from the start, but it was going to be very difficult to apply the type of pressure that President Johnson wanted to apply, or the Department of Defense wanted to apply against North Vietnam in that way. Again, I think that Johnson is not only constrained by not wanting this war to widen, by wanting to keep it focused on Vietnam. So this, from a certain point of view, from Johnson's and the administration's perspective, this makes perfect sense. All right, obviously, as we began to attack targets in North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese air defenses began to proliferate almost at an alarming rate. In fact, as the surface-to-air missiles and the AAA are introduced, they catch a lot of our initial missions in 64 and 65 by complete surprise. We can see them setting up SAM sites, and it's a surprise when they actually begin to fire the missiles. They catch our guys a little bit off guard. Now, there's a couple of problems with the way that we go about attacking the North Vietnamese air defense system. One is that we don't really attack it as a whole. Two is our early aircraft, the F-4s, from both the Air Force and the Navy, operating in 64 and 65 and 66, really through 1968. They're older version of the aircraft. They don't have radar homing and warning. So it's not until kind of the midpoint of the war that our aircraft are even equipped with the technology to know that they are being targeted by the Fansong radars. So you've got three principal opponents if you are an American flying a Rolling Thunder mission between 1965 and 1968. You have the surface-to-air missile threat, you have the AAA threat, and then you have the MiG threat. The MiGs come in three varieties, the 17, 19, and 21. The surface-to-air missile threats are obviously your high-altitude threats, and your AAA threat is your low-altitude threat. But American pilots kind of felt that they were damned if they did, damned if they didn't. If they flew low, they were in AAA range. If they tried to get above that, they came into the envelope of SAM fire. So while most of our aircraft are lost to AAA and not to SAMs, it is because the SAM threat is so potent that we have no other option but to attempt to fly low and fast. So you can see here the air defense system that North Vietnam sets up to go against the American attack aircraft. You can see that there are numerous MiG bases throughout the north. The most famous of those probably being Phu Quien and Kep. And then you can also see the surface-to-air missile envelopes that surround Hanoi and Haiphong. And again, even though Hanoi and Haiphong are for the early part of the war, principally off-limit targets, that is obviously where the North Vietnamese set up the bulk of their surface-to-air missiles. So one more kind of, I would say, separate air war that occurs in North Vietnam, and this is really an offshoot of the out-country war in the north. Obviously, if MiGs are a threat, then you are going to have to go after that MiG threat, and this becomes kind of a separate air-to-air war that occurs in the skies over Vietnam. Again, a lot of these, we don't have any aces until 1972. And you'll also note that the Vietnamese People's Air Force has over 15 aces during the conflict. Ace is, I don't want to say an outdated and outmoded term. It's an easy way, I guess, to keep track of success in air-to-air combat. But these were what we consider the last of the American aces. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons that the North Vietnamese obviously have more aces than we do. Pilot rotation, cruise rotation for the U.S. Navy. Rather, the North Vietnamese pilots simply were going to fly until they either died or survived the war. And again, here we go with another kind of separate air operation that's going on. And this is going to go all the way back to one of the first slides I showed, which was the strategic supply route of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so what we do there, this is, again, a separate type of war. This is an interdiction campaign. What we are attempting to do in Laos and Cambodia is stop the flow of supplies from the north to the south. The problem is that the trail is not even a trail. It's more like a bunch of arteries and capillaries in the human body. And so if you cut off one of the capillaries, the blood's simply going to flow around and go into another one. Laos and Cambodia during the American conflict in Vietnam become two of the most heavily bombed countries on earth both of which far exceed the tonnage of bombs that we dropped on Germany during the Second World War. And I don't find that at any time during the Vietnam conflict are we ever able to really stem the flow of supplies that go down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We try everything. We try electronic warfare. We try to drop markers so that we can hear what routes the North Vietnamese are using. One of the more entertaining things I found in the research was that as we would drop radio receivers that could hear truck movements down the trail, the North Vietnamese would simply place tape decks next to these monitors that would play the sounds of trucks moving down the trail. And then obviously they would drive somewhere else. But this war in Laos and Cambodia also takes place almost in the dark from the American people. All right, throughout the war in Vietnam, the American people are almost completely oblivious to the fact that we are heavily bombing Cambodia and Laos. So what we see here is that we have had 4 to 6 separate air wars. By 1972, I think the context of the war has changed. And then that is when we get into the linebackers, both 1 and 2. The Americans view linebacker 2 as the conflict that really got us out of North Vietnam, that allowed us to leave with honor. What I find fascinating about linebacker 2 is that the North Vietnamese call the battle, and you might have heard this earlier today. I'm sorry I missed the linebacker 2 story. The Dien Bien Phu of the skies. So the Americans claim it as a victory. The North Vietnamese claim it as a victory. To be perfectly honest, I think they both have valid reasons why they can claim it. But it is definitely not something the Americans, I think, could have kept up. Although we lose 16 B-52s are shot down during the linebacker 2 operations, probably another dozen aircraft successfully return to Thailand, but they never fly again. And the Air Force doesn't count as a combat loss if it's able to land back on the runway, even if it never takes off again. And so it's linebacker 2 that really brings a conclusion to the American conflict in Vietnam. I will add, and I will stress, that if linebacker 2 does anything, if it changes anything at the negotiating table, it's that it absolutely secures the release of the more than 500 American POWs being held in North Vietnam. And that really concludes my presentation. I know that we're going to do questions later, so I will definitely hang around for that. But again, just thanks to everyone who put this on. Thanks to everyone who put this together, and I sincerely appreciate being a part of it.
Dr. Brian, thank you very much for your presentation. Really, a really interesting topic about the American air wars of Vietnam. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So remember that those who enjoy these 3 days of the seminar will be able to obtain a certificate of attendance to the event. So right now, we will take a 10 minutes to break and come back with the next presentation. Para quienes nos escuchan desde el habla hispana, vamos a tomar 10 minutos de break y regresamos con la siguiente presentación. Volvemos pronto. So we come back. Remember that INISEG organized the 6th International Congress Challenge to the Global Security. You can live the experience in person at the School of War of the Army of the Air in Spain, or you can also watch in streaming for those who are interested and are in another part of the world. So take a note, save the days from April 26 and 28. So really, really soon, we send more information about the Congress. So David, our next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Laura. The next speaker this afternoon is US Army retired Lieutenant Colonel Don Snedeker, historian, 11 Armored Cavalry veterans of Vietnam and Cambodia. The title of your talk is the use of armored forces in a counterinsurgency. You can start with your presentation done. Thanks.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Let me pull up my slides.
It's okay.
Okay, so good evening. My name is Don Snedeker. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Cavalry, and I'm a second generation Black Horse trooper. You see our patch and unit crest on the slides. Second generation because my father joined this regiment when it was still horse cavalry, and he served in part of World War II in this regiment, and I served in this regiment in Vietnam for a little while and also in Germany. So my briefing today is going to cover these subjects. My primary objective is to prove to you that counterinsurgency is not just an infantryman's war. That was what everybody believed at the time, but it's not. I believe, and I hope at the end of this, you will believe that a combined arms team is decisive for battlefield success. And the lessons learned from the application of this combined arms team, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment and the infantrymen in the U.S. Army, is a lesson learned that is still applicable for counterinsurgency today. There were a number of preconceived notions that set the stage for our involvement in the Vietnam War. Obviously, the British example in Malaya, the French example, obviously Group Mobile 100, and Bernard Fall's several books about the tragedy of that event. Our own experience in the Pacific Theater in World War II led us to the conclusion that counterinsurgency was a light infantryman's war. Even our own armor school in the United States believed that back in 1962. I'll let you read this quote from a study by our armor school. A number of armored cavalry squadrons, that's a battalion size unit, a number of armored cavalry squadrons deployed with their divisions to Vietnam in 65 and 66, and they began to dispel this notion that armored vehicles could not operate in the rice paddies, in the jungle, and elsewhere in Vietnam. These pictures show the difficulties of operating, especially during the monsoon. The picture in the left-hand bottom of the slide is an armored personnel carrier, an armored cavalry assault vehicle, swimming in mud that was a consistency of peanut butter. And you'll see that a lot of the infantrymen who were running the war said things like, hunting Viet Cong with tanks is like chasing a fox with a tractor. Our own leadership of the regiment had been told that you're going to get to Vietnam and you're going to sink into the sunset, and all you're good for is protecting bases and running on the roads. I will tell you from personal experience that this armored cavalry platoon of 9 vehicles, if that fox was being chased by these tractors, well, maybe that fox ought to be afraid. The weather and the terrain were obstacles to our operations in Vietnam, and sometimes things like this happen. That's an M48A3 tank stuck in the mud next to a road in Cambodia in 1970. I've talked to the platoon leader whose vehicle that is, and he told me it took them 3 days to get that vehicle out of the mud. But the mud was not just an obstacle for armored vehicles. These South Vietnamese infantrymen are having trouble in the mud as well. So the weather and the terrain were obstacles to warfare in Vietnam, not just to armored vehicle warfare. And certainly this happened sometimes. The enemy's rocket-propelled grenades and landmines, recoilless rifles were very effective anti-tank weapons, and we lost vehicles. But those same weapons and others also were effective against helicopters. So it wasn't just not good for armored vehicles, but their weapons were effective, and we had to overcome those obstacles. So in 1967, the Army Chief of Staff said, let's do away with those preconceived notions and let's find out what the facts are. He established a group of officers and non-commissioned officers and specialists from across the Army, infantry, armor, armored cavalry, engineers, and they went to Vietnam and they talked to hundreds of vehicle commanders, drivers, vehicle evacuation specialists, commanders from platoon all the way up through brigade. And their objective was to find out what the facts were, to evaluate the tactics, techniques of operation of armored forces and figure out, was there a role for armored forces in a counterinsurgency? One of the things they did, they developed these kind of go, no-go maps. And the map that you see here is for the 3rd Corps area where the regiment, our regiment, the Black Horse Regiment operated. But they did a map like this for each of the Corps areas showing where vehicles could operate during the dry season and during the wet season. And even though there was that preconceived notion that you can't operate anywhere, you can see from these maps alone that there were plenty of places where you could operate even during the wet season. And in fact, it was not just in the 3 Corps area where our regiment was located, but you'll see these numbers and they show that most of the country was trafficable by at least the armored personnel carriers, if not the tanks, all year round. One of the conclusions of the McOV study was that doctrine was also changing. That part of the problem with the French experience in Indochina and our own experience in the Pacific in World War II was that doctrine had not adapted to the realities of a jungle warfare environment. And so this quote is from the McOV study that talks about armored cavalry becoming a combat organization, not just a reconnaissance and security organization. And that's key to understanding the role of armored vehicles and armored formations in a counterinsurgency. Part of the reason that the French had the problems in Indochina was their equipment. The equipment that they had was not designed for cross-country movement in the jungle, in the rice paddies, and so they got stuck a lot, and they were stuck on roads. But before the regiment deployed to Vietnam, they took the M113 armored personnel carrier, shown in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, and made it into an armored cavalry assault vehicle, shown in the bottom left of the slide. They added armor onto each of the machine guns and added 2 additional machine guns. So this was an assault vehicle. Exactly right for the mission, the revised doctrine, exactly right for the war and the times. This is a picture of an armored cavalry assault vehicle from Alpha Troop 1st Squadron 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in 1969. And you'll see from the diagram on the right, the 2 additional M60 machine guns, 7.62 millimeter machine guns, and the armored shields in front of both of those machine guns and around the track commander's position. So they were protected from small arms fire by those armored shields. The crew of this vehicle, a driver, the track commander, 2 side machine gunners, and a 5th crew member who had an M79 grenade launcher stood in the back in the cargo hatch, and they were a very effective, very lethal team and combat vehicle. The regiment also had M48A3 tanks. Each of the squadrons had 17 of these, 52 tons of American steel. This particular tank has quite a story. On the 21st of May, 1967, this tank was leading a convoy on the road in South Vietnam, and it was ambushed. The 40 or so crew members of the 8 vehicles were ambushed by a Viet Cong battalion of 600 Viet Cong soldiers. So it's 40 against 600. And this tank was hit 14 times by rocket-propelled grenades and recoilless rifles fire. 2 of the crew members survived, and they fought the tank and helped to save the rest of the platoon during that ambush. 3 months later, exactly on the 21st of July, 1967, this very same tank, repaired, was leading the 3rd Squadron on an operation on another road. They were ambushed, this time by a regiment and a half. It took 2 RPGs that made it immobile. The crew survived and helped to fight off that regiment and a half. And the convoy survived, went on with its mission, and that regiment was so depleted by the armored firepower of the 3rd Squadron that they didn't appear on the battlefield for another 6 months. This is the organization of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam. It was the only armored cavalry regiment in Vietnam. You can see the numbers in the 2 boxes, about 4,000 troopers. When you added all of the additional units that were supporting it, it ran to about 4,500. There were over 400 tracked vehicles, almost 50 helicopters, and they were all under the command of one individual, Black Horse 6, a colonel. And that's really important to this story, because having all of this combined arms, firepower, and armor protection and mobility under the command of one individual made a huge difference. He didn't have to call up another colonel or a general and say, give me some helicopters, I'm in the middle of a fight. Or help me out here, I need more trucks. Everybody in the regiment had a ride in a wheeled vehicle, in a tracked vehicle, or in a helicopter. And that's critical to the understanding of how a combined arms force is part of a combined arms team during a counterinsurgency. Every one of the 3 squadrons had all of these forces in their squadron. They had reconnaissance scouts, tanks, an infantry squad in every platoon, an artillery battery in every squadron, helicopters for command and control and reconnaissance, combat engineers, medical, intelligence. and everybody worked for Black Horse 6, that colonel. So he could call, everybody had a radio, he could call and say, time for you to move out and pile on to this fight. And they were responsive because they worked for him. They didn't work for somebody else. They couldn't say, oh, gee, boss, you know, I got something else going on here and I really don't have. You worked for the same man. He told you to jump, you jumped. And so this was really important. And I will tell you that as a 23-year-old lieutenant in Vietnam, I was a platoon leader in an armored cavalry squadron. And I had 55 soldiers who worked for me. And in my platoon, I had scouts, I had tanks, I had infantry, and I had a mortar. And we were all in armored vehicles. We all had radios, and we could do some butt kicking. This was the motto of the regiment in Vietnam. And let me explain what that means. Typically, an aero scout would find a target flying over the jungle or wherever, would see something that just didn't look right, or some dummy on the ground said, oh, that helicopter saw me, I'm going to shoot at him. And that started the fight. So the aero scout was typically accompanied by a Cobra helicopter, a gunship of some sort. And so that was the first unit that took on the enemy. The aero scout, as soon as he told the gunship to come in and start fighting, he would call in artillery. He would call his boss, who would call the regimental commander, the command post, and say, we got a contact here. The command post would look at the map and say, what's the closest ground unit? Call that squadron, that armored cavalry troop, that tank company, whatever it was, and say, here's where the fight is, pile on. And it continued to pile on as long as we had 4,000 some odd troopers, 400 armored vehicles. So the regiment was able to find trouble, take care of that trouble, and then go out and create some trouble for the bad guys. And that's what was significant about this regiment and about the notion of armored vehicles in a counterinsurgency that dispelled all of those preconceived notions that had gone on for years. The picture you see here is the 2nd Squadron, 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, one day before going into Cambodia on the 1st of May, 1970. This is what, and it's only a part of the squadron. Each squadron had 100 and some armored vehicles. Imagine if you were the bad guy on the ground that took that pot shot at that helicopter, and all of a sudden, all of these armored vehicles and artillery and engineers and aviators started piling on your head. It might make you think twice about shooting at the guy next time. This is a real eye chart, but I'll just point out a couple of significant things. The light infantryman that was deployed to South Vietnam in the United States Army was armed primarily with the M16 rifle. And when a company of light infantry went out into the bush and was looking for the bad guy and ran into typically it was a North Vietnamese or Viet Cong battalion, they were outgunned automatically. The AK-47 was a more powerful weapon than the M16. The NVA battalion had more rocket-propelled grenades. They had more machine guns. They had more mortars than that infantry company. But if you look at what's lined out in the center there, if you look at that regimental reconnaissance troop, 2 armored cavalry platoons, 1 cross-attached platoon of tanks, you can see that automatically the North Vietnamese Army or Viet Cong battalion that they ran into was outgunned significantly outgunned by more than 90 machine guns, as well as the 5 tanks that had the 90 millimeter cannon, plus mortars, plus artillery, plus. And so this is the major contribution of armored vehicles, of armored forces in a counterinsurgency, the ability to survive the initial blast because of the armored vehicles that they're in, and to be able to overwhelm with fire superiority. So what, you might ask? What difference did it make? Well, I can speak to the 11th Armored Cavalry specifically. It was located in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, which was in the vicinity that included Saigon, a lot of rice-producing region, a very populous area of South Vietnam. And when the regiment arrived in 1966, the 5th Viet Cong Division, shown on the right of the slide, held sway east of Saigon. They collected taxes. They intercepted roads. They ambushed the South Vietnamese army units. They conscripted labor, and they conscripted guerrillas. They conscripted and taxed and had their way. Within 1 year of the regiment being in that area, the 5th Viet Cong Division was forced to move away from where they had been living for years, had to get out of those villages, had to go to War Zone D across the river, and they weren't in contact with the source of what Mao says is the ultimate objective of any guerrilla war, is to control the people. They couldn't tax the people. They couldn't get food from the people because they were in the middle of the jungle and had been pushed out by the armored vehicles and firepower of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. 2 years later, 1969, what was surely the bloodiest year of the war, the 5th Viet Cong Division was a mere shadow of its former self. In the Tet 68 offensive, 2 regiments of that division did not make their attacks as they were scheduled to do in the Saigon area. A, because they were so far away, B, because they were so depleted, and we harassed them as well as the 3rd of the 5th Cav. Several other units in the area kept the 5th VC Division from making any contribution whatsoever. The other 2 major divisions, the 9th VC and 7th North Vietnamese Army Divisions, had been pushed away from the Iron Triangle, from the area closest to Saigon, and were pushed very close to the Cambodian border, where they were much less effective, and again, couldn't tax, couldn't recruit, couldn't get food from the local population. That's what happened in '69. And then, of course, by 1970, all of the divisions, except the ragged 5th VC, were across the border in their Cambodian sanctuaries. They had been pushed out of South Vietnam completely. And then in the 1970, June 70 operation in Cambodia, the 1st NVA division was, let's just say that they were stung quite badly as the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment moved along Highway 7 and into the area where we found, the 1st Cav Division found several of the arms and weapons depots, medicine depots, and it took the North Vietnamese Army, the enemy, took Hanoi 18 months to recover from that operation. And the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the armored vehicles of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the helicopters led the way on the ground and made a huge difference. So what are the lessons learned that apply to today? the armored vehicle protection saved crews' lives. It's a simple fact. You can survive that initial blast of the ambush, of the meeting engagement, of whatever it is that you're faced with. You can survive that and then create fire superiority by the large number of weapons on your vehicles. The fact that you are mounted on a vehicle gives you the mobility to respond quickly to a wide range of areas. You have to have radios on all those vehicles. That enhances the command and control. And as I stressed earlier, unity of command of this combined arms force is critical. I don't care what you want to call this combined arms team. Call it an Armored Cavalry Regiment. You can call it a Star Wars Brigade or a combined arms team or whatever you want to call it. The fact is that a simple infantry solution by itself is not going to work. You have to go with the combined arms team. This is the primary lesson learned, and it applies to Somalia, it applies to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to wherever we are called upon to operate. You can modify the equipment, you can adapt doctrine. If you've got the leadership, you can use those armored forces in a counterinsurgency warfare very, very effectively, regardless of the weather, regardless of the terrain. If you want to learn some more about our Black Horse Regiment, these two books are available on Amazon from Casemate Publishers. And that ends my briefing.
Thank you very much, Don, for this excellent paper on the use of armored forces in counterinsurgency, and in your case, how they were used during the Vietnam War. Thank you very much, Don, for excellent paper.
Yes, indeed. Okay.
So now we turn to our next speaker, Eugene Carrion-Wayne, Academic Fellow of the Institute for Peace and Conflict and doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Texas Tech University. And her talk will be about Lotus in Sea on Fire, the U.S. Mobile Adversary Teams in Vietnam. So Eugene, we say welcome to you, and the audience is all yours.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, let me try to share the screen. Can you see the
Yeah,
title?
we can see.
Very good. Well, hello everyone, and good evening to anyone in Spain. It is my honor and privilege to be here today with other distinguished speakers to share with you a part of my doctoral research. Looking at this incredibly complex war from a bottom-up approach and through the lens of some American field advisor or the US Army Mobile Advisory Teams, their Vietnamese foot soldier advisee, and the local population. I also would like to take a moment to express a peaceful prayer for the Ukrainian people and all humans and their family who are suffering from warfare, and express my sincere appreciation for all participants in this conference, scholars, historians, and audience who have given your time, your attention, and your interest to continue researching and learning about a conflict in my country that has traumatically impacted many generations of Vietnamese people from all sides involved. I would like to start with a year, 1967. This year witnessed two pivotal events in the war, and both of these events will prove to us rather decisively that we cannot separate the military and civil aspect of the conflict in Vietnam, because it was a highly complex struggle in which multiple dimensions, such as the social, economic, political, and military dimensions, were intricately interconnected. The first event was the publication of this book, Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, by the renowned Thich Nhat Hanh, who often known for his work on engaged Buddhism and mindfulness practice in everyday life. And I quoted this title of his first published book in English in the title of my presentation today, in tribute to his lifelong advocacy for peace for the Vietnamese, as this respectable teacher had just finished his journey on earth not too long ago, earlier this year. This book expressed the desire and struggle for a lasting and meaningful peace of the majority of the Vietnamese people who were suffering tremendously and got entangled in the middle of this horrific and multi-dimensional conflict. And they did not want to take any sides. As being observed from his 1965 trip, when he went up the Thu Bồn River to visit some remote villages, Sơn Thuận, Khương Bình, and Cà Tang villages, the peasants in these remote areas hated both the NLF and the GVN sides. When being asked which side they would follow, some of the peasants told Thich Nhat Hanh that, quote, "We do not follow either. We follow the one that can end the war and guarantee that we can live." So this feeling, right, this feeling of the Vietnamese peasants reported by Thich Nhat Hanh was very similar to what, and I will use the quote of one match advisor in 4 Corps, Team 32 in Tram Chim village, King Phong province, as this match advisor observed in 1969, quote, "The farmers and fishermen in my district wanted to be left alone so they could work to provide for their families. They were not political, and most of them would fall in line with whoever was in power." So you can see the similarity there. The second event that I want to talk about in this year, 1967, was the creation of the Office of Civil Operation and Revolutionary Development Support, or the abbreviation is CORS. And this office, under the direction of MACV, or U.S. Military Assistant Command Vietnam, was responsible for providing military and civil support of pacification. It was the first time in the history of this prolonged conflict that the U.S. formally integrated civil and military advisory effort in support of the government of Vietnam pacification into one unified single command. CORS helped to unify a wide range of various programs which had been operating independently and at times disjointedly by either military or civilian agency previously in South Vietnam. CORS had 12 directories that I won't read all of that to you, but some of the examples were the territorial forces, the Chiêu Hoi or open arms program, education, health, agriculture, etc. In October 1967, CORS also created a new program called the Mobile Advisory Teams, or throughout my presentation today, I will use the word MAT to train the territorial forces, which we will discuss more in detail about each group within these forces in the next few slides. So let's look at the basic standard structure of math. As you can see, math team structure was very small. We have to take into consideration the wider context, right? That this program came out when the war was approaching its Vietnamization phase, and many American personnel were already being withdrawn. So manpower and resources were very limited, 5 men only. Each team consisted of 2 officers, 3 enlisted men, and often an assigned Vietnamese army interpreter. And you can tell that math team had a very rough job, and they often had to stretch themselves very thin in Vietnam. You can imagine with 5 men, right? If one already been on radio watch, let's say at the team house, that would leave them with only 2 of the 2-man team left to, rotate between accompanying the local unit on daylight operation, night ambushes, or, on top of other advisory duty every day. And toward the end of the war, many maths also were downsized to only a 3-man teams or being incorporated into the limited remaining personnel in their district team. Let's talk about their duties. Math had multifaceted mission, including both combat and non-combat elements. Being Army Field Advisor, their primary mission was to advise and instruct their advisee, the local soldier, on field fortification, barrier system, indirect fire support, small unit operation, weapons employments. However, what many people do not aware is that besides providing combat assistance and infantry small unit technique training for the local soldier, Math Advisor also helped the Vietnamese civilian in countless ways, such as working with the local official, in this case, usually the village or the hamlet chief, to develop their defense plans, to collaborate with various Vietnamese agencies in the village for intelligence operation, for other civic actions, such as community development project, building school, setting up healthcare clinics, developing agricultural programs, and in overall trying to help and improve the villager living condition. Being rolled out rather late in the war, there was arguably no uniform set-in-stone procedure of how to utilize math personnel across South Vietnam. In the Mekong Delta, for example, I know based on my oral history with some of the math advisors that some of the team would have a contract agreement that would, clearly define their mission and duration in a certain area. But that was not the case everywhere else. If you listen to Colonel Philippe Rogers' presentation earlier today on the Marine CAP teams, you can see the very contrast different, right? Whereas CAPs were only in I Corps near the DMZ, the Army math program was spanning across all 4 corps in South Vietnam. Operating right in the middle of these rural villages and hamlets, the math advisor lived with the Vietnamese civilian community and fight alongside their local advisee soldier and the indigenous unit. They had to face unique challenges and endure constant mental stress, physical exhaustion, and the psychological terror from this irregular warfare. Their daily threat were consisted of both the NVA main enemy force and also the NLF insurgents. Matt had to build a mutually trusting relationship with their local counterparts to survive themselves and to help their advisee and their family to survive. Another huge issue for Med advisor was the issue of language. Although some of them might already have had the benefit of attending a Vietnamese language course in the state through the Defense Language Institute, and each Med team was often having a local translator, but the linguistic barrier remained very high. As one advisor said, quote, "There are cultural differences that can make even simple social exchanges exhausting because you must constantly be on guard against the inadvertent offense to your counterparts and the local people, and be certain that you are being understood and that your intent is not being clouded by some nuance missed in translation," end quote. Each Med experience varies significantly depending on where they were in Vietnam and when they were there, which year, which location. There might be, a regular unit-based camp. There might be a CB that the Med team was in close proximity and could possibly share some food resources. Med teams also had to learn many differences across South Vietnam from big to small level, such as the regional geography, cultural differences, various ethnic groups, political religious sects, local security situation, the history of a nuanced balance between the number of enemy forces maybe hiding in the jungle surrounding a hamlet and the number of friendly forces inside that hamlet. So, all of these differences impacted each Med team differently. Regarding their duration, some Med, for example, stay in an area for around 4 to 6 months, and then they would move on to another area, and sometimes they would come back for just a checkup or refreshment, a refresher training. But some other Med team never move and remain static throughout their tour. Another example, some district could have no Meds assigned to them if they were, closer to the urban area, closer to their province capital, and were considered more secure. One important thing to remember is that just like their fellow American advisor who were assigned to a regular divisional ARVIN unit, Med advisors were there and designed to function only within an advisory capacity, not in a commanding position to their respective counterparts. So, who were their counterparts and advisee? We shall find some answer in the next slide. Let's look into the first group, the regional forces. And I have on the slide some of the statistical information just for your reference. But basically, the RF or the regional force, they came from the Civil Guard under the First Republic era of South Vietnam. And they were badly neglected, arguably until 1967, when Vietnamization and the focus on pacification came more into the forefront. The creation of corps, like we discussed earlier, and the creation of Med program lay an important foundation for the build-up of these local units. I won't repeat the number already on the slide, but as you can, tell that within, for example, within just 3 years, the RF force level increased quite significantly. And they also bore the bigger burden of combat death, accounting for 55% of South Vietnamese killed in action for the period from 1965 to 1972. The RF operated at the district level and was responsible for territorial defense across around 236 districts. In the last few years of the war, RF force structure was strongly developed, from separate companies into communist groups, battalions, and even some bigger group that they would operate at province level. Some med advisor told me that they remember advising and help, to organize Liên đội or Linh đội. On the slide, you can see the picture that was shared with me by one of the med interviewee. And this is a picture of Liên đội 15. And their med advisor explained to me that the difference between an RF battalion and a Liên đội is that an RF battalion would have 4 rifle companies and a heavy weapon sections, whereas Liên đội 15, for example, had 5 rifle companies and they were more flexible and mobile. So, think about them like a quick reaction force. Also a little bit on language here, right? So Liên, L-I-E-N means linkage or interconnectedness, right? Đội, D-O-I means team. But, sometimes we also call them Linh đội, and L-I-N-H, Linh means flexible. In the picture, you can see that the Liên đội soldier, they wore a red scarf, and some also had a unique red emblem above their name tag that denote which element of the Liên đội they belong. And do not let the body size fool you. An average South Vietnamese infantry soldier is often around 10 years older than his American counterparts, and often had 7 years or more combat experience. After all, these local soldiers had been fighting since as early as 1955. Let's look at the second group of the med advisee, and these are the popular forces or PF who were, operating at the village level. Again, you can take a quick glance at the statistical information. The PF force level was also increased significantly, and they were arguably one of the most cost-effective military forces employed on the Allied side. They inflicted 30% of enemy combat death, but received only up to 4% of the total budget. And yet, they had to carry the responsibility of territorial defense for around 2,500 villages across South Vietnam. In this slide, I would like to draw your attention to the last but not least group that the med team was, helping to train them and advise and support them. This is the People's Self-Defense Force, or the PSDF, at the hamlet level. And the concept was that as these people was able to help protecting their own community, the PSDF would free the RF and the PF for movement further out into the countryside, or to be mobilized in joint operation with other Vietnamese regular units. Again, you can see that they rose significantly from 1 million in 1969 to 4 million within just a year. And the advisory number also increased accordingly, right? So in 1967, there were only 108 UN advisors attached to the militia. But in 1969, so a few years later, this number has increased to over 2,000. The US Army created MAT, hoping that these advisors operating from the foundation of popular support would be able to encourage and to involve these people more into the common defense of their own families and communities. However, perhaps the most complex and important aspect, which often was understudied, is that this engagement and involvement had to be done essentially in a Vietnamese way and respecting the local dynamics, and not to be done predominantly in an American way, in order to yield any meaningful result for the South Vietnamese people, long-term peace and security. Lotus in a sea of fire. Who knows how to defend and preserve the Vietnamese lotus better than the Vietnamese people themselves? In this slide about the PSDF, I also want to draw your attention to the fighting motivation. Of course, like any other topics in the Vietnam War, it was very uneven, reported through various magazines, and it was controversial. But one of the helpful points for us, right, to think about it as we cannot undermine the context of the general mobilization in the post-Tet period. And that created a pressure to quickly expand the force level in the face of US withdrawal. The Saigon draft after that was expanded to men from 18 to 38 years old. And to put this in perspective, at that time in the United States, the draft age would be between 19 and 26. And the rest, right, you would wonder, so what happened to the rest of the Vietnamese people? So those like the youth from 16 to 17 years old, or older men from 39 to 45, they were also called up for the militia or some technical support service. And the Saigon government at that time also recalled veterans of either age bracket if they have no documented disability. And they also had no specific length of required service. They had to serve until the war is over. Having said that, having taken all of that into consideration, there was also an understudy element of volunteerism among these citizen soldiers. Research has shown that these territorial soldiers consistently accounted for the lowest desertion rate because they were, living close to their home. And you can imagine that if they have an empathetic unit leader with some lenient, flexible leadership style, these soldiers could go home to help with their family working in the rice field, for example, during the harvest season. And to fully understand the territorial soldier morale and desire to serve close to their home, one has to have a deep understanding of Vietnamese culture and history. Very rarely any American soldier or advisor had this understanding before they were being deployed to Vietnam. For example, and this is the last bullet point on this slide, I have put and also use a different color to draw your attention is the concept of hue, right? Which is a moral obligation and a devotion to ancestors and to elder, member in the family, grandparent, parents. As a South Vietnamese soldier explained, quote, "My primary role in this life is to provide for my family and to venerate my ancestors. It was very difficult to leave the village. I would rather have died with my family at home than leave them and not be able to care for them," end quote. The fighting motivation of the Vietnamese local soldier often stem from a strong tie to their personal attachment to their ancestral homeland and their family. A PSDF SWAT leader, for example, in Ba Xuyen province, When being asked, why did you join the PSDF? He answered, quote, I have 7 good reasons for devoting some 40 hours each week to the defense of this hamlet, my wife, our 5 children, and my home, end quote. So that PSDF squad leader was one of these people in the middle that the med advisor got to work with very closely and help defending and bringing a safer, a better everyday life to their family. Med advisor got to see very closely the cause of war, the horror, the sorrow that the war inflicted on these people every day. And they got to ask, they got to learn, they got to reflect about these questions. What the war was about from a bottom-up perspective that many other Americans did not have that chance. What the war was about. The answer can be very different depending on who you ask the questions, right? I don't know, did you tune in yesterday, but if you ask a high-level decision maker, as Dr. Tyler White presented yesterday, the answer would probably be along the line of some of their assumption, their geopolitical concern about, the domino theory. Or if you listen to a very informative presentation of Dr. Brian Leslie earlier today, the answer would probably have to involve some strategic air operations. But what if you ask the people on the ground? What if you ask that questions to a med advisor or a Vietnamese advisee? For many Vietnamese people, the war was about family survival. As one Vietnamese soldier wrote in a letter to his wife, quote, the war is about you and our family. I know that the war will end one day, and then we can resume our normal life, end quote. So this phrase, the people in the middle, I quoted it from an incredible memoir of Lily Hayslip. She is a Vietnamese refugee writer and philanthropist. And her memoir and title was When Heaven and Earth Change Places, a Vietnamese woman journeys from war to peace. And I want to read for you a quote from her memoir. Quote, long before you arrived, my country had yielded to the terrible logic of war. What for you was normal, a life of peace and plenty, was for us a hazy dream known only in our legends. Because we had to appease the Allied forces by day and were terrorized by the VC at night. We slept as little as you did. We obeyed both sides and wounded up, pleasing no one. We were people in the middle. We were what the war was all about, end quote. So, from that phrase, people in the middle, I want you to invite you to think about the role of MED in Vietnam and their civilian engagement. Because I argue that MED advisor went through a dual process of learning and unlearning, right? So on the unlearning part, they have to unlearn the things that they carry either consciously or unconsciously into the job and realize that maybe some of their presumption or assumption about the local population code, hearts and mind, might be inaccurate comparing to the people reality. And Matt also learned new things about the Vietnamese people. For example, many American GI often assume that the Vietnamese people had become callous to human feelings after being in the war for so long, so many years. But in contrast, many med advisors will tell you that they learn from their own observation that these Vietnamese people, mom and dad, just like any other parents, just like, you know, American parents, they love and they care deeply for their children. Want to tell you a story, an anecdotal evidence that shared with me by a med advisor in Fort Corps, Team 25 in Định Tường province. And this happened in the later phase of his tour around March 1972. At that time, many U.S. regular troops and advisors were already being withdrawn or phased out, and the remaining personnel in Vietnam was stretched very thin. And his MAC team had an assigned interpreter by the name of Mr. Bình, who lived on the compound with his wife and two small children. One day, a couple of U.S. captains from the district advisory team and for Định Tường province, that was district team 66, they came by and they asked this med advisor to borrow Bình to use on an operation the next day. And they left early the next day. They were ambushed on the way back, and Mr. Bình was killed, and one of the U.S. captain was also wounded. So the med advisor had to tell Bình family that he was killed, and his body was also brought to the med advisor to give to his family in the hamlet. Bình mother couldn't understand how her son was actually shot in the head during the heated days of Tet offensive and lived through it, make it out alive. But this time, Bình was shot in the legs, and he was with one of the cố vấn, or the Vietnamese phrase for U.S. advisor, and he died. How? So the mother, you know, in her grief, couldn't comprehend that. And the med advisor told me many years later that it was a femoral artery wound and Bình was bled to death. But we can see right from the tragic story that med advisor play a uniquely important role in this critical juncture of the war. They were not there just teaching the local soldier how to shoot. They were not there just to call in artillery and air support. But my research and, you know, countless interview looking at a lot of primary and secondary sources tells me that med were there in Vietnam as human beings and represented somebody that's trustworthy and caring enough to provide specific assistance for the villager everyday life needs. And therefore, I argue in my dissertation that med was an important part of the Vietnamese people's hope for peace. Translator Bình grieving mother was not alone. As you can see in one of the pictures on the slide, another mother was burning incense in grief of losing both her daughter. If you can see the Vietnamese word that I put in there, con gái means daughter. And at the same time, she also lost her daughter-in-law, con dâu, in 1968. Med advisors saw, you know, this devastating human cost of the war every day in their tour. Or, you know, picture can speak volumes, right? That's why I love pictures. In the top picture, you can see the wife and the little kid children of a PF soldier came out to the bunker to visit and to support their husband, their father, and she will take up that firing position if needed. You know, many GI, they did not understand, and they often make fun of the local soldier wife and relative for hanging around and criticizing and blaming them for potentially like affecting the soldier fighting morale. In reality, it was the opposite. The close proximity of families was the strongest, if not the only reason for many local soldiers to carry on the fight. If you're familiar with Vietnamese military history, we also have many national heroines or female warrior like the Trung sister. And also I put that on the slide so you can, think about it. In Vietnamese tradition, we also have a saying that giặc đến nhà, đàn bà cũng đánh. It means when the enemy comes to their homes, the women will also fight. So, it's very important for us to look at this conflict from the bottom-up perspective, from, the perspective of multiple sides, so that we can understand, this whole tragic war in a fuller and deeper manner. Another insight that I would like to share about the MAD in Vietnam was that this conflict between the MAD advisor and the other regular American soldier, because MAD live with the local people in close proximity, right? And they fight alongside the local soldier. So they got to see the Vietnamese through a more truthful and compassionate lens. They empathize with the people hardship and unimaginable sorrow. And they got to see the Vietnamese as human beings who deserve respect. One of the MAD advisor in, this is the one in Quảng Nghĩa province, Tự Nghĩa district. So this is up in the I Corps. And he recalled the story that one day a US convoy moving down the road in his rural hamlet at a breakneck speed. And partially out of fear, right, of being attacked, but also out of arrogance, because a lot of Americans at that time, they felt superior to the Vietnamese and justifying for themselves that after all, we were fighting their war for them and we pay for everything, including this national highway. So this US truck crashed into a Lambretta, and if you're not familiar, it was a kind of bus that often served as mass transit for the local people. And this terrible accident resulted in 3 Vietnamese people in serious condition and 4 others that could use some medical attention. But the issue was that the lieutenant in charge of these regular US soldiers had recklessly not called for medical support because none of his American personnel was hurt. Instead, he called for possible reinforcement. And this is what he said. He said, just in case that I had to fight my way out of this good traffic jam, end quote. And I sincerely apologize for using the G word in this historical context, but language matters. His verbal expression suggests to us that there was a racial component in the overall anti-Vietnamese attitude among the GI in Vietnam. So what did the MAD advisor do? He got immediately on his radio and called in his team medic to help the people. He also arranged for a medevac to help, bring the wounded Vietnamese people out. He also called in the South Vietnamese district chief. He confronted the American lieutenant and his troop and insisting that they were not going anywhere until the Vietnamese district chief make things right for the injured people on that Lambretta. And this is what the Vietnamese district chief told the angry villager. He obviously tried to cool them off and told them that my American, the local advisor, were different from the Americans you all had just encountered. My Americans were here to help. So that's why, I put that in quotation marks so you can think about the difference that through the words of this Vietnamese man telling his people in that district, in that village, the difference between the Americans and my Americans. Later on in his memoir, he wrote, and this is, something that also being observed, as I put in that verbal quote, right, being observed by other MAD advisor. the one in Canton Village, Long Khánh Province. They try to express, their deep concern about the American lack of historical and cultural knowledge of the Vietnamese. So, what we see here is a discrepancy between the perspective of those med advisors who serve and live so close to the Vietnamese allies and those who were just passing by these rural villages. This is my last slide, and I have some point that I would like to share with you before we jump into the Q&A section. So movies, Hollywood, right? They often glorify war, and they put the warrior on some sort of a pedestal, and they call them heroes. And throughout my research, I learned for myself that this is not what many veterans wish. And that is certainly not what the historians do. We try to look at the war from multiple angles, and most importantly, from the lens of the human who were directly involved in it. People often, share about success, case study, or think about failures. But the point is that there was so much more nuances in between that never had been spoken nor listened to. The Vietnam national flower is the lotus. Usually this kind of flower, it grows in muddy water, but still, rise above the dark surface with strong roots and delicate, but, sustainable petals aiming for the sun, for the light. The lotus symbolizes the Vietnamese value of integrity, of purity and resilience in hardship. And I argue in my dissertation that those who serve with mobile advisory team in Vietnam were among very few groups of Americans during the war that got to see and to feel that lotus in the most close-up and truthful manners for themselves. These advisors, they had an insightful familiarity and knowledge of their allies, of their advisee, of the Vietnamese people, not from any training manual or textbook, but based on their own cross-cultural interaction and experience, based on what they saw by their own eyes and how they felt by their own heart. We have throughout my presentation today, right? We look at some statistical evidence. We look at some anecdotal evidence. So in this last slide, I want to draw your attention to some conceptual approach by discussing two important concepts regarding the veteran post-war experience that often being conflated and rather misunderstood. So the first concept is PTS, or post-traumatic stress, that some of you might already study about, and it is often described as how human ability to process and regulate emotion was impaired by the prolonged and extreme trauma. But the second concept, moral injury, to put it in a simple terms, if you think about PTS, about like what the war did to you, moral injury is more about what you did to or saw people doing in the war. Moral injury is not PTS. Is it possible for a veteran to have moral injury without BTS? A good book about this, and I put the the cover of the book on the slide and the ISBN number so you can refer to, is called Soul Repair. And the book defines this concept, quote, moral injury is the result of reflection on memories of war or other extreme traumatic conditions. It comes from having transgressed one basic moral identity and violated core moral belief. So moral injury can cover both combat and non-combat situations. Mad veterans could be suffering from moral injury from seeing someone else violated their core moral value, or they might be feeling betrayed by the person in authorities, right, who violated the mad veteran conscience, the value, the belief that give meanings to their life that has always been their moral compass, define who they are. It can be related to witnessing a fellow MAD team member, an advisee, a local soldier, a counterpart, the South Vietnamese civilian and their family who were terribly mistreated. You can argue that this is very similar to the concept of survival guilt. But in this case, whom the afflicted MAD veteran had survived are not only some of their beloved fellow Americans, but also countless Vietnamese civilian, villager, translator, whom they had tried to support in that particular important phase of the war within the very limited amount of time that they had. In the counterinsurgency, doctrine, right? You heard this phrase earlier today, winning hearts and minds. My research suggests to me that what these MAD advisors were doing is more about learning to develop genuine empathy and gain a deeper understanding about what these hearts and minds really were first. And, the more they understand, the more they empathize with the people. And the more they empathize, the more they understand. So it's like, like a loop, like a circle. And I argue that the reason that they suffer is because they have that shared basic humanity deep inside within each combatant and the civilian. That humanity, that shared humanity, was the reason for them to be able to do their job in Vietnam. And it is also the reason to help understanding their struggle in the post-war period. On the slide, you can see this very interesting pair of pictures, right? That's shared with me by a MAD veteran. He came back to visit the village that his MAD team served in Vĩnh Long province, and he found his own friend. The little boy back then is now a father of 9 children and is also a grandfather. So the point is that the human friendship is real, the historical connection is real, and we never know. We would never know how many Vietnamese people survived the war thanks to the presence of MAD in their village, and vice versa. We will never know how many MAD advisors survived their tour in Vietnam thanks to these Vietnamese villagers. By studying this war through the lens of Mobile Advisory Team, we are returning historical agency and honoring that shared humanity to these advisors and their advisee. The story of each MAD advisor matters because, to me, each of the Vietnamese people that they interacted with also matters. And that's all I have. Thank you so much for your attention, for your listening. I really appreciate it. Very grateful.
Eugene, thank you very much for your presentation. You really enrich our students and the audience.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Jen. Gracias, Laura. Vamos a pasar ahora a algunas preguntas de los participantes de esta tarde del seminario. Tenemos alguna pregunta. We have a few questions for our speakers. The first of which is for Captain Arthur Gulliksen. What made United States leaders in 1972 believe that the use of air power could achieve their stated political objective?
Oh, thank you for the question. There's many factors at play in the fall of 1972. the Americans can't invade North Vietnam. There's no huge amounts of ground forces there that have remained that, you know, can be deployed into any part of North Vietnam or affect the North Vietnamese in a major way. And time is running out. As I said before, the US Congress was very much in a position to cut off money for the war. Nixon had met with Brezhnev to effect détente. In the discussions that occurred, he came away from it very much understanding that he had, to a certain effect, carte blanche to do what he needed to do to extricate the United States from military involvement and deployment in South Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, to achieve his U.S. foreign policy goals. So what does he have left? He's got this massive air power contingent, you know, all the tactical fighter forces in the 7th Air Force and a huge number of B-52s that can be massed in Guam and in Thailand, that had been, to a certain degree, very, very successful in interdicting the 1972 Easter Offensive. And the success of these forces had made Nixon very, very confident in their possible future performance to achieve what he needed to achieve in the very short-term basis, which was the main two goals: free the POWs, drag the North Vietnamese back to the peace table in Paris, France, in order to sign some kind of deal that would allow the US to leave with some kind of face and free those POWs. So the F-4 Phantoms and the smaller airplanes, the F-111s, etc., it just wasn't going to do it. He needed something brutal. He needed something quick and something with massive firepower to absolutely create such damage on such a scale that the North Vietnamese would be pushed beyond that tipping point of what is acceptable. Of course, the North Vietnamese were in a position to hold Nixon hostage and have the money for the war and his leverage on the peace table be taken away by the US Congress. And so, and it wasn't too far a goal for the Americans to push the North Vietnamese. So they didn't have to push them that far. The North Vietnamese, of course, wanted the US out of the war. They wanted, the U.S. forces withdrawn, no more combat, and of course they could agree to anything. And once the U.S. was gone in 1974, 1975 comes along, they can do what they want, and they do what they want in a massive invasion. And in this process, this massive use of air power for this absolutely brutal assault on the infrastructure of the Hanoi area, Haiphong, is there a racist component to it? Would we have seen the same use of U.S. air power in, say, a Caucasian European continent? It's something important to consider. Does this give Nixon the ability or make him comfortable with the idea in his mind to use this massive air power in a way that LBJ, President Johnson, never did? And of course, in this display, nobody wins. The North Vietnamese don't win. The large sections of the area around Hanoi are destroyed. There's quite a few losses to the B-52 crews, as well as the tactical fighter bomber units. But it does free the U.S. POWs and does get them out in a very decisive fashion. So this brutal use of power that was possibly incomprehensible or unthinkable to the Johnson administration and other potentially U.S. military leaders is finally unleashed by this, in a way that makes Nixon be characterized as a madman, the madman complex. And of course, the Vietnamese, the U.S. prisoners of war in the various Son-Tay prisons, et cetera, report that the Vietnamese are very much shocked and shock and awe occurs. They've never been attacked in this way, in this brutal fashion. So it achieves what Nixon wants to achieve. The Vietnamese see the cost of continuing to resist diplomatically, and the destruction that's been occurring in front of them into their capital area in the Haiphong Harbor. And of course, they give in to the Americans. And a peace deal is signed. The prisoners of war are freed. But it's hard to say it's a victory for anyone. But that's just my opinion, one of many academic opinions out there. But hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for your response and for your interesting contribution to this seminar. Thank you.
So we have other question for Dr. Brian. And how did this experience affect Air Force doctrine after the war?
Yeah, both the United States Air Force and the United States Navy, particularly the tactical air arms, the fighter pilots of both services, make extraordinarily changes to their doctrines, both during and in the aftermath of the war. The U.S. Navy famously creates the Top Gun School in 1969. That doctrinal changes has immediate impact when we go north again in 1972. Of course, technology plays a little bit into this. We had better identification friend or foe, combat tree, and other tactics and technologies that aided us. But the Navy had made almost instantaneous doctrinal changes. The Air Force took a little bit longer in the aftermath of Vietnam. By 1973, you see the creation of the aggressor squadrons. And the aggressor squadrons are U.S. Air Force squadrons used to basically mimic a Soviet style of warfare. So they fly F-5s and T-38s. Much later, they will fly something along the lines of the F-16. And these are much smaller, nimbler, faster aircraft, and they are meant to mimic the Soviet MiGs. And so the aggressor aircraft initially kind of travel around to different Air Force wings to teach the Soviet way of war, which was, of course, kind of the North Vietnamese Air Force way of war. And then in 1975, the United States Air Force creates this operation known as Red Flag. And what Red Flag was units from around the Air Force would travel to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, and there they would go up against the aggressors. And it was a 2-week exercise, and it was meant for the tactical air forces to engage with Soviet styles, with IAD systems, and that really helped fundamentally alter the Air Force's way of war in the post-Vietnam era. I would say that the strategic air forces, so the B-52 bomber pilots, took a little bit longer to begin to change their tactics and doctrine, even after Linebacker 2. They did come out to Red Flag, and in the first 2 or 3 instances that they participated, they essentially got schwacked. And it was the SAC pilots who said, hey, we need to go out and integrate with the tactical air command pilots and change our way of warfare. So both weapon schools, aggressors, the Red Flag exercises all went into this enormous training revolution that took place in the aftermath of Vietnam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian. Continue with that. I have other question for you about, did the strategic application of air power achieve the president's political goal of ending U.S. military involvement in the war?
Yeah, I think Dr. Galashan, and I don't mean to mispronounce your name there, kind of talked about it. I think the important thing was that along with what he said, that there were no winners and losers there. I think it did allow us the exit with honor that we were looking for. It did allow us the ability to get the POWs home, which was vastly important to the United States military. You're talking in the neighborhood of 500 prisoners of war who by that time were all being held in and immediately around Hanoi. So I guess the short answer is yes, that strategic application of air power allowed Nixon to exit Vietnam, but I would juxtapose that with the idea that the North Vietnamese certainly viewed linebacker as a win for them. So it's fascinating as a historian. You can look at the exact same operation, the exact same mission reports, the exact same perspectives. There's no doubt that the bombers caused tremendous damage in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. And we as Americans certainly look at that as, is the end of the war, but it's fascinating that you can juxtapose that against the North Vietnamese, who certainly view linebacker 2 as a win for them, as they called it, the Dien Bien Phu of the air.
Thank you, Dr. Brian.
Thank you. We have a new question for Don Snedeker. Were the strategies in the use of armored units in Vietnam effective, Don?
I absolutely believe that in the case of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment and the divisional armored cavalry squadrons that were in country starting in 66 and up through 72, they evolved and became very, very effective. In the run up to the Tet of 68 offensive, the MACV staff was in fact going to ask for another armored cavalry regiment after resisting the deployment of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in 66. They were going to ask for another one to go up to I Corps because they discovered that this was a very effective piece of operational success. And so it obviously, after Tet of 68, and we didn't increase our troop size, we started downsizing. But otherwise, if that had not been the case, another regiment was scheduled to go to Vietnam. So I think that says to me that the MACV planners even were convinced, oh, this works. And I think I've spoken with another Black Horse soldier. He served in Vietnam as a unit commander. He was in Somalia as the 2-star in charge. And he said, if I had had an armored cavalry squadron, Mogadishu would have come out very differently. So I think the short answer is yes.
Okay, thanks, Don, for your response.
And we have other question for Eugene. Eugene, what were the main economic consequences of the Vietnam War?
Thank you, Laura. Wow, that's a big question. So I can only, speak from my research, right? And one of the book that I just think of in my mind that might be able to help that audience to answer that questions about the economies. The book is called After Saigon Falls by Dr. Amanda Demers that I just, had the privilege to write a review for the Journal of Military History. And in the book, you will see some of the author discussions about diplomatic and also included the economic consequences of the war. But from the perspective of these Med Advisor underground, I can share with you that they understood, the struggle economically of these very, very poor South Vietnamese civilians. Throughout my presentation, I hope that I have pointed to you the citizen soldier aspect of their advisee, right? The RF, the PF, and the PSDF, right? They receive very low payment, and some of the financial support, right, that comes down from the province, from the district. Obviously, it will also impacted by the local authority corruptions that being observed and reported by multiple MAT teams. So that also affect the people in the villages and in the hamlet. I hope it answers somewhat these very big questions about the economic impact.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Eugene. So, David, your final words for this seminar.
Okay, Laura, thanks. Muchas gracias, Laura. Quería ante todo agradecer a todos nuestros panelistas de esta tarde por sus excelentes aportaciones, análisis, reflexiones y sobre todo los diferentes temas tan importantes que nos han mostrado sobre la guerra de Vietnam. Además, dar las gracias, como no, a todos los asistentes que un día más pues, han estado siguiendo las presentaciones de nuestros ponentes y por sus interesantes preguntas que han estado pues, a la altura de este gran seminario y realizando sobre todo en estos 2 días que llevamos de actividad académica. Así que, sin más preámbulos, nos vemos mañana para finalizar con el último día del seminario, con otras excelentes aportaciones de nuestros ponentes invitados y, evidentemente, también esperaremos vuestras interesantes aportaciones de las preguntas que les estamos haciendo a nuestros panelistas. Muchas gracias, Laura.
And from INISEG, we want to say thank you to all participants, attendees, and speakers who were on day 2 of this incredible INISEG University seminar, The Vietnam World. Great presentation and round of questions from everyone, and second day that we have late history again. So see you tomorrow, our final day of the university seminar, The Vietnam War. So see you.
Gracias. Hasta mañana.